There were three things Flora Thomson knew about winter in the Highlands: that it arrived without asking permission, that it brought with it dangerous men disguised as saviors, and that no promise made by the fireside survived the morning light, until she met Duncan Ross. And then all the certainties she carried crumbled like snow at the touch of warm hands. If you love intense historical romances with honor, forbidden passion, and irresistible Highlander heroes, subscribe to the channel now and hit the like button. This story will steal your heart, I promise. The wind arrived before the snow, as always happened in the Highlands when November bid farewell. Flora Thomson was in the kitchen when she heard the howl tear through the door cracks, bringing with it the smell of frozen earth and damp moss. Nell, her maid and only true confidant, looked up from the cauldron where she was stirring a thick stew of barley and salt beef. "It will be a cruel winter, this. Dear lass, I can feel it in my bones." Flora smiled faintly as she draped a piece of thick wool over her shoulders. Nell always said that, every year without fail, and every year winter came with the ferocity the Highlands demanded, indifferent to the predictions of maids or the prayers of reverends. "Then we had best prepare the candles soon. Tradition does not wait for those who doubt." Nell let out a rough laugh, the kind of laugh that carried decades of loyal service and friendship built in shared silences. "Tradition, tradition. Always with those pretty words, Flora. But I will tell you one thing. Tradition doesn't warm anyone when the storm is at the door. Only the courage of the one who lights the lamp does that." Flora did not reply, but her hands were already moving with purpose. She took 3 thick tallow candles saved since the last Yule, each wrapped in raw linen cloth. The wax still carried the scent of honey and rosemary, herbs Nell insisted on mixing in to ward off the restless spirits of winter. Superstition or faith, Flora never knew for sure, but she lit the candles just the same. "Let's go to the great hall window before it gets dark for good." The two crossed the narrow stone corridor, where the cold clung to the walls like persistent moss. The Thomson estate was not a castle, but a respectable tower house, with a slate roof and walls thick enough to withstand the biting winds that swept down from the She Mountains. They had lived there for 3 generations, ever since Flora's grandfather received the lands as a reward for loyalty to the MacLeod clan. They were not wealthy, but they had a name, and in the Highlands, a name still meant something. The great hall was empty when they entered. The fire crackled low in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows over the faded portraits of the Thomson ancestors. Flora stopped before the wide window that looked out onto the heather-covered valley. Outside, the daylight was already dissolving into shades of grey and violet, and the first mist of the evening was beginning to rise from the slopes like cold fingers seeking entry. Nell opened the window with effort, pushing the wooden sashes against the wind that insisted on closing them. The frigid air invaded the room, bringing with it tiny ice crystals that sparkled for an instant before melting in the residual heat of the hearth. "Hold here, lass. I will light them." Flora held the frame while Nell struck the flint against the metal, creating sparks until the first candle was lit. The flame trembled, nearly went out, but resisted. One by one, the 3 candles came to life, and Nell positioned them on the sill with reverent care. "May the light guide the lost and ward off those who do not deserve to enter." It was the ancient blessing, whispered by generations of Highland women during Yule. Flora repeated it in silence, moving her lips soundlessly as she watched the flames steady themselves against the wind. That small, stubborn light was a promise. Any traveler wandering lost in the darkness would find refuge there. It was unwritten law, stronger than any oath sworn before laird or king. "Are you finished with the prayers?" The deep voice cut through the moment like a sharp blade. Flora turned quickly, her heart racing from the surprise, and found her father standing in the doorway of the room. Angus Thomson was a broad-shouldered man with a greying beard, his face marked by deep wrinkles that looked more like scars left by time and worry. He wore the Thomson tartan over his shoulders, fastened by a silver brooch that had belonged to his own father, and carried in his eyes that weariness Flora knew too well. "Yes, father, the candles are lit." Angus nodded, but did not enter the room. He remained there, on the threshold, as if something prevented him from crossing the distance between them. Flora knew that silence. It was the silence that came before the difficult words, the decisions already made without consultation, the truths that would change everything. "We need to talk, Flora. Come with me to the study." Nell exchanged a quick look with Flora, the maid's brown eyes filled with a concern that needed no words. Flora lightly touched her friend's arm, a brief gesture of gratitude and farewell, before following her father down the corridor. The study was small and smelled of old leather and writing ink. A single narrow window let in the weak light of dusk, and the oak table was covered with papers and maps of the Thomson lands. Angus closed the door carefully and walked to the fireplace, where he stood with his back to his daughter, watching the embers slowly die. "You know that I am a man who thinks of the future, Flora. Not my future, but ours. The future of these lands, of this family." Flora clasped her hands in front of her body, trying to control the trembling that began to rise through her fingers. She knew her father's tone. It was the tone he used when speaking of alliances, of debts, of survival. "I know, Father. Then you will also know that times are changing. The lowland men climb further and further north, bringing their laws, their ambitions. If we do not protect ourselves now, we will be swallowed whole. And protection, my daughter, is not won with swords alone." Flora closed her eyes for an instant, feeling. The ground moved beneath her feet. She knew what was coming next. She had always known ever since she was a girl, and saw other young women of the clan given over to men chosen by their fathers, like pieces in a game of chess, played for generations. "I received a proposal 2 weeks ago, from an influential, educated man, with vast lands in the lowlands and connections that can guarantee our autonomy for decades. George Lennox." The name left Flora's mouth like poison, disguised as a whisper. Angus turned slowly, his eyes narrowed, surprised. "How do you know?" "I saw the way he looked at me when he was here, Father. It was not a look of courtesy. It was a look of possession." Angus sighed deeply, running his hand through his greying beard with a weary gesture. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a few weeks, his shoulders bowed under the weight of decisions no man should make alone. "Lowland men appreciate what they cannot easily obtain, daughter. Do not take it as an insult. It is a rare compliment." "Compliment, Father." Flora took a step forward, her voice still low but vibrating with an emotion she rarely allowed to escape. "His eyes did not greet me. They assessed me, as if I were cattle to be traded at the Inverness fair." The silence that followed was dense, laden with everything that could not be said. Angus averted his gaze, unable to face the naked truth in his daughter's green eyes. He will return for the Yule feast, with the intention of formalizing the commitment. He will be our guest of honor, and I expect, Flora, that you will treat him with the courtesy due to a man of his standing. And what if I cannot? Then you will learn. The words fell like stones into the frozen lake, sinking without a sound. Flora knew that no plea, tear, or argument would change her father's decision. He had already yielded to the invisible pressure of political alliances, veiled threats, and the fear of losing. Everything the family had built, and she, as the only daughter, was the bargaining chip. Without saying anything more, Flora left the study. Her bare feet touched the cold stone floor as she crossed the corridor back to the great hall, where the 3 candles still burned in the window. Nell was there waiting, and upon seeing the girl's face, she did not need to ask. She simply opened her arms. Flora allowed herself to be embraced, but she did not cry. Tears were a luxury that Highland women learned early to deny themselves. "He is marrying me to George Lennox at Yule." Nell squeezed her friend's shoulders hard, the kind of strength that only comes from someone who loves without asking for anything in return. "There are still weeks until Yule, lass, and many things can happen when winter bites." "Many things." Flora did not reply. She only looked at the candles in the window, at those small, stubborn flames that defied the icy wind. And for the first time in her life, she wished that someone lost in the darkness would see that light, someone who could change the destiny that already seemed written in stone. On the other side of the valley, in the Ross Tower house, Duncan stood before the fireplace, watching the flames dance with the same silent intensity with which he observed everything in life. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the stone walls, and he held a tankard of whiskey that had already grown cold between his fingers. He was not drinking. He was just holding it, lost in thoughts he shared with no one. Yule was approaching. He could feel it in the change of the wind, in the way the men of the clan began to talk of feasting, of dancing, of renewals. For Duncan, Yule had always been just another completed cycle, another winter to be endured, nothing more, until this year. "Are you thinking of the Yule traditions, brother?" Thorquil's voice was accompanied by the sound of heavy boots against the stone. He entered the room with that wide, carefree stride he always had, throwing himself into one of the wooden chairs with a theatrical sigh. He was 3 years younger than Duncan, but he spoke as if he had lived twice as long, always with a crooked smile on his lips and a provocation on the tip of his tongue. Duncan did not turn around. He merely raised the tankard to his lips, pretending to drink. "I do not often think of traditions, liar." Thorquill stretched his legs toward the fire, crossing his ankles. "You are thinking of the one where a man may kiss a beautiful maiden beneath the mistletoe, and, if fortune favors him, find love before the winter ends." Duncan finally turned his face, giving his brother a look that should have silenced him. It did not. "Or perhaps you are thinking of cutting the Yule log alone this year, like a mountain hermit who has forgotten what a woman is." Thorquill. Duncan. The two stared at each other for an instant, and then Thorquill let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "I do not know how you manage to live like this, brother. Serious and closed off as a locked door. One of these days, life will pass you by and you will not even notice." Duncan returned his gaze to the fire, but something shifted in his expression. A shadow crossed his face, so brief it was almost unnoticeable, but Thorquill knew his brother too well. "Ah, so you have noticed." Duncan did not answer, but in his mind, without his being able to prevent it, the image arose of a young woman with red hair standing at the edge of the snow-covered path, weeks ago, with a basket of bread in her arms and the bluest eyes he had ever seen in his life. She had not noticed him. She had just continued on her way, leaving light footprints in the fresh snow, while he had stood there frozen like an idiot, unable to look away. He did not know her name. He did not know where she came from. It was not the first time he had seen her, but the feeling was always as if it were the first. He had kept that image as one keeps a live ember in one's chest, burning slowly, never extinguished. A corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly, a half-smile that lasted only for the length of a breath. Thorquill saw it, and he smiled too, but without mockery this time. "There is hope for you yet, brother." Duncan took a sip of the cold whiskey, feeling the burn go down his throat, and turned his eyes toward the narrow window that faced the valley. Outside, the night already enveloped everything, but in the distance, on the other side of the heather-covered hills, he saw 3 small points of light flickering against the darkness, candles lit in a window. The ancient tradition, the silent invitation, the promise of refuge. Duncan did not know why, but something stirred within him, something that had been dormant for too long. Flora did not know yet that on the other side of the valley, Duncan Ross was also looking at that same light, and that their lives were about to intertwine in ways neither of them could foresee. The snow began to fall that night, silent and inevitable, covering the highlands with its white mantle, and with it, it brought the promise of changes that not even the cruelest winter could freeze. The morning arrived cold and grey, with thick mist rising from the valley like ghosts seeking shelter. Flora awoke before dawn, as she always did, but this time, sleep had not allowed her to rest. She had spent the entire night tossing under the wool blankets, haunted by images of George Lennox and his dark eyes that seemed to reveal what was hidden. They broke the will, wounded dignity, and touched the very soul. She dressed slowly, choosing the thick moss-colored wool gown that Nell had sewn last autumn. She tied her red hair in a loose knot at the nape of her neck and covered her shoulders with a faded tartan shawl that had belonged to her mother. As she touched the fabric, she felt a sharp pang in her chest. If her mother were still alive, would she have allowed her father to give her away like this, as a bargaining chip in a political agreement? She did not know the answer, and that frightened her more than it should. She went down to the kitchen where Nell was already preparing the morning bread. The smell of toasted oats and honey filled the air, bringing a small but necessary comfort. The maid looked up when she entered, and immediately frowned. "You didn't sleep at all by the looks of it." "I slept enough." "Don't fool me." Nell wiped her hands on her flour-stained apron and pointed to the bench by the table. "Sit down. I'll make you an herbal tea before you leave." Flora obeyed, not because she wanted to, but because she knew that arguing with Nell was futile. The woman had 40 years of accumulated stubbornness and used every ounce of it when necessary. While the water boiled over the fire, Nell returned to kneading the bread dough with firm rhythmic movements. "Are you taking it to the children today?" Flora nodded. It was her tradition, started 2 winters ago, when she first saw the children of the village workers going hungry, as supplies ran out before spring. Since then, every week before Yule, she took bread, cheese, and sometimes dried apples to the most needy families. Her father never forbade it. He merely looked on with silent disapproval and commented that she had too soft a heart for a woman who would need to govern a household someday. Perhaps he was right. Nell placed the steaming mug of tea before her and rested a calloused hand on her shoulder. "What are you praying for, lass?" Flora looked up, surprised. She had not realized her lips were moving in silent prayer. "For a miracle, Nell. I pray for a miracle that will free me from this marriage." The maid sighed deeply, squeezing the young woman's shoulder with gentle force. "Miracles exist, Flora, but sometimes they come disguised as a storm, and when they arrive we must have the courage not to run from them." Flora did not understand what Nell meant. She merely drank the tea in silence, letting the warmth travel down her throat and heat the emptiness that had been growing inside her since the conversation with her father. When she finished, she took the wicker basket that Nell had prepared with still warm round loaves and left through the back door. The cold air hit her face like a slap, stealing her breath for an instant. The mist still covered everything, turning the world into shades of grey and white, and Flora pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked down the stone path leading to the village. The streets were more crowded than usual. Yule was approaching, and with it came the preparations. Men cutting wood for the Yule log, women weaving wreaths of holly and yew, children running between the houses with green branches in their hands. There was an energy in the air, an anticipation that Flora normally loved. But today, everything seemed distant, as if she were watching life happen through a frosted glass. She found the children where she always found them, near the village well, with worn shoes despite the cold, in clothes mended so many times that the original fabric had almost disappeared. There were 5 in all, between 4 and 10 years old, children of a widow who worked as a washerwoman and could barely feed herself. Miss Flora, the smallest, a girl with black hair and enormous eyes, ran to her with open arms. Flora knelt in the frozen mud, not caring about her dress, and embraced the child with genuine tenderness. "I brought you fresh bread. It is still warm." The little girl's eyes lit up in a way that made Flora's heart clench. She distributed the loaves among the 5 children, watching them bite into them with fierce hunger, and smiled. A genuine smile, perhaps. The first in days. There, in that moment, she was not Angus Thompson's daughter nor George Lennox's future wife. She was just Flora, doing the only good she could do in a world that insisted on being cruel. "God bless you, milady." The voice came from one of the mothers, a woman too thin for her own frame, with hollow but grateful eyes. Flora nodded slightly, refusing the thanks with gestures, and stood up, wiping the mud from her knees. That was when she felt it, a presence behind her. Strong, silent, impossible to ignore. She turned too quickly, her foot slipping on the wet stone, and before she could fall, 2 firm hands gripped her arms. The impact stole the air from her lungs, not from the strength of the touch, but from the heat that radiated through the fabric of her dress, burning her skin like a live ember. She raised her eyes, and the world stopped. The man before her was tall, taller than any man she had ever known, broad shoulders covered in a dark ross. Tartan, black hair slightly wind-tousled, and stormy blue eyes that seemed to see through her, past her, inside her. His face was sculpted in hard, masculine lines, a strong jaw covered by a full, well-kept beard, and there was a seriousness there, an intensity that left her speechless. He did not smile. He did not speak. He merely held her, his eyes fixed on hers, and Flora felt her heart pound in a way she had never felt before, as if the organ had awakened for the first time, violent and alive. The seconds stretched, 2, 3, 5. Then he spoke. His voice was deep, husky, charged with something Flora could not name. "What is your name, lass?" The words left her without thought, as if forcefully ripped out. "Flora. Flora Thomson, daughter of Angus Thompson." He nodded slowly, as if engraving the name somewhere deep within. His eyes swept over her face, not with the invasive manner of George Lennox, but with something different. Curiosity, recognition, reverence almost. "I know your father, but I do not recall us having been introduced, Miss Thompson." Flora swallowed hard, struggling to find her own voice. "I have stayed indoors much in recent years. My father prefers it so." "I understand." He released her arms carefully, as if afraid to hurt her with his touch, and took a step back, but his eyes did not stray. "I spend a great deal of time on missions, with the clan, protecting the borders." Flora nodded, unsure what to say. There was something about him that disarmed her completely, something that made her want to stay there, standing on that muddy street, just to hear that deep voice for a few more moments. Then, without thinking, she held out the basket with the last loaf of bread remaining. "Would you like one? It is tradition to share before Yule." He lowered his eyes to the bread, and for the first time, something shifted in his face. It was not a smile, but a softening, as if an invisible wall had been moved for an instant. "Thank you." He took the bread with large, calloused hands, hands that seemed made to hold swords, but which touched the food with unexpected delicacy. Flora watched as he raised the bread to his face, smelling the warm aroma that still rose from it, and something in the gesture completely unsettled her. She needed to leave. Now. "I must return. My father will be expecting me." He nodded but said nothing. He only watched her take a step back, then another, his eyes still fixed on her as if he were memorizing every detail. "It was a pleasure to meet you, sir. Duncan Ross." The name hung in the air between them, loaded with weight, with promise, with something Flora dared not name. She turned and walked quickly down the street, her heart beating so hard she feared everyone could hear. She did not look back. She could not, because if she looked, she knew she would not be able to leave. Duncan remained there, standing in the middle of the street, holding the bread that still radiated warmth between his fingers. He watched Flora disappear around the bend in the path, small flakes of snow in her red braids swinging with her hurried steps, and something within him stirred, something deep, ancient, inevitable. Thorquil appeared beside him, coming from somewhere between the houses, with that annoying smile already on his lips. "So that is her." Duncan did not reply. He just kept looking at the spot where Flora had vanished. "The red-haired lass who left you mute as stone weeks ago, a beautiful lady with a gentle heart and blue eyes that haunt your dreams." "Shut up, Thorquil." Duncan finally averted his eyes from the empty path and faced his brother. He said nothing, but Thorquil saw the answer in his stormy grey gaze. Yes, she was worth it. 3 days later, George Lennox arrived. The black carriage crossed the gate of the Thomson property at noon, pulled by 4 white horses that seemed far too clean to have travelled the muddy roads of the Highlands. Behind it followed 2 armed riders and a servant carrying fine leather trunks. Flora watched from the upstairs window, hidden behind the linen curtain, as her father descended the entrance steps to greet the guest. George emerged from the carriage with the calculated grace of one who knew he was being observed. He wore dark, expensive clothes, lowland cut, with discreet lace at the cuffs and a gold brooch on his chest. His hair was combed back, revealing a face many would call handsome, but which to Flora carried something disturbing. He smiled as he greeted Angus, a perfect, polite, empty smile. And then, as if he knew exactly where she was, George Lennox raised his eyes to the second-story window. Flora instinctively recoiled, her heart racing, but she knew it was too late. He had seen her, and by the way his smile widened, slow and possessive, she knew the hunt had already begun. The welcome dinner was served in the great hall that same evening, under the uncertain light of candles, and the fire crackling in the fireplace. Angus had insisted that Flora come downstairs, dressed in her best dark blue wool gown, her hair tied up in elaborate braids that Nell had done with quick fingers and constant grumbling. Flora sat at the table like a condemned person walking to the gallows, her shoulders rigid, her hands clasped in her lap so tightly that her knuckles were white. George Lennox occupied the seat of honor to her father's right, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of one who knew that everything there already belonged to him. He spoke of his lands in the lowlands, of political connections, of influence that reached even Edinburgh, and Angus drank in every word like a thirsty man drinks water. Flora barely touched her food. She only pushed pieces of roast meat around the pewter plate, her stomach too unsettled to eat. "Miss Flora?" George's voice cut through her thoughts like a sharp blade. She slowly raised her eyes, forcing herself to face him. "Yes, Mr. Lennox. Your father tells me you have a custom of helping the less fortunate in the village, an admirable practice for a young lady of your position." There was something in his tone, something that transformed the compliment into something lesser, almost condescending. Flora felt a blush creep up her neck, but she kept her voice steady. "It is not admirable. It is duty." George tilted his head, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she did not. She would not give him that victory. Duty. He repeated the word as if savoring expensive wine. What an interesting word. So many today forget what it means. "But you, Flora. May I call you Flora?" She did not answer. He continued as if she had. "You seem to understand that we all have roles to play, obligations to fulfill, and that, I must say, is a rare quality in a woman so young." Angus smiled, clearly pleased with the turn of the conversation. Flora felt nausea rise in her throat. "Highland women are raised with a sense of responsibility, Sir Lennox. My daughter is no exception." "Oh, but she is." George leaned slightly forward, and Flora watched as his eyes scanned her face, dropping briefly to her neck before returning to her eyes. "She is exceptional in every sense." The dinner proceeded in tense silence, punctuated only by George Lennox's calculated compliments and Angus's measured responses. Flora had barely touched her food, pushing pieces of roast meat around her plate as she fought the nausea that rose in her throat every time she felt George's gaze settle upon her. When the plates were finally cleared and Angus rose from his chair, Flora sighed with relief. Freedom, at least temporarily. "Mr. Lennox," Angus said, wiping his mouth with the linen cloth, "I would like to show you how our community prepares for Yule. The village hall is in full activity tonight. It will be a good opportunity to meet our people and our traditions." George bowed elegantly, his smile polite but empty. "It will be an honor, Angus. I admit I am curious about how the Highlands celebrate winter. In the lowlands our festivities are, shall we say, more contained. Then prepare for a pleasant surprise." Angus turned to Flora, who was already rising from her chair, eager to escape. "Flora, fetch your warmest shawl, you will accompany us." Her heart plummeted. She looked at her father, seeking some mercy in his eyes, but found only determination. He was building bridges, forging alliances, and she was the mortar that would hold it all together. "Yes, father." Nell appeared with the shawls and cloaks, helping Flora bundle up against the cold that was already invading the house through the cracks. George watched every movement, his dark eyes never leaving her, and Flora felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter. They left through the main door, following the stone path that led to the center of the village. The night was clear, the full moon illuminating the snow with a silvery glow that made everything almost magical. The air was filled with voices, laughter, and the distant sound of a flute playing an ancient melody. As they approached the large community hall, a stone and wood building that had served the village for generations, the music grew louder, accompanied by the scent of fresh pine and spices. George walked beside Flora, maintaining a proper distance, but close enough that his arm occasionally brushed hers. Each touch made her want to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. Angus marched ahead, proud, eager to show off his community. When they entered the hall, Flora was immediately enveloped by the warmth and life. Dozens of people worked in small groups. Women braided wreaths of holly and yew. Men carved small wooden figures. Children ran between the tables carrying green branches. The fire crackled in two massive fireplaces at the ends of the hall, casting a golden light over everything. "Impressive," George murmured, but there was something in his tone that suggested more condescension than genuine admiration. "So rustic." Flora bit her tongue. She wanted to defend her people, her culture, but she knew any word would be used against her later. So she remained silent, watching the preparations with a lump in her throat. That was when she heard a deep, familiar voice near the entrance. "Mr. Angus Thomson, good evening." Flora turned so quickly that her shawl almost slipped from her shoulders. There, at the hall entrance, stood Duncan Ross Thorquill and another man she vaguely recognized as James Smith, one of the most respected advisors of the Ross clan. All three wore formal tartans, and Duncan held a small wooden chest in his hands. Angus spun around too, surprise and pleasure lighting up his face. "Mr. Ross, what a pleasant surprise." He crossed the hall with long strides, extending his hand. "I did not expect your visit tonight." Duncan gripped the offered hand firmly, his eyes briefly sweeping the hall before settling for a fraction of a second on Flora. She felt the impact of that gaze, as if it were physical contact. "Thorquill reminded me that it has been too long since we participated in the Yule preparations with the Thomson community, Duncan said, his voice calm but loaded with something Flora could not decipher. And we have brought our contribution. He raised the wooden chest, and James Smith, a grey-haired man with shrewd eyes, smiled. Beeswax for the Yule candles, Angus, from our own hives, and some herbs that James here insists improve the aroma. They improve it because they do, James replied, in a deep but amused voice. My grandmother swore that rosemary and lavender kept the restless spirits of winter at bay, and who am I to doubt the wisdom of a woman who lived 86 years? Thorquill laughed, and even Angus smiled, clearly pleased with the company and the gift. Your grandmother was wise indeed, James. Come, join us. We were just showing our traditions to our guest from the lowlands. It was only then that Duncan looked directly at George Lennox, who was observing the scene with a carefully neutral expression. The two men measured, each other in silence, a brief moment heavy with tension that Flora felt to her bones. George was the first to move, crossing the distance with calculated steps and extending his hand. Mr. Ross, I am George Lennox from the lowlands. I have heard much about you. They say you are the most skilled warrior in the Highlands. Duncan shook the offered hand, but the gesture was mechanical, devoid of any warmth. The Highlands are full of good warriors, Mr. Lennox. I merely do what I must. Modesty. George smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Another rare quality these days. Thorquill, ever observant, sensed the tension and decided to intervene in his easy-going way. Modesty is what they call it when someone prefers to let actions speak. And Duncan speak loud enough. He winked at James. Though James here is better with words than any of us are with swords. Mr. James let out a rough chuckle. I prefer to solve problems with wisdom rather than steel. It is true, but, he looked at Duncan with a knowing smile, it doesn't mean I don't appreciate a good fight when necessary. The conversation flowed, the men moving toward one of the tables where women were working on the wreaths, and it was there, as George turned to make some comment to Angus about the decorations, that it happened. Duncan, under the pretense of depositing the wax chest on a nearby table, passed beside Flora. It was brief, less than 2 seconds, but as their shoulders nearly touched, she heard his voice so low it could have been imagination. Are you well? Flora did not answer. She could not, but her fingers trembled slightly against her shawl, and that was answer enough. George turned back at that moment, his eyes going directly to Flora with that possessive intensity she was beginning to hate. Miss Flora, come. I would like you to show me these traditions up close. He extended his hand, not as an invitation, but as an expectation. Flora looked at his hand, then at his face, and felt her stomach churn. But before she could force herself to take it, George stepped forward and simply touched her arm, guiding her toward one of the tables where older women were braiding holly. Explain the meaning of these plants to me, George said, but his fingers remained on her arm. A light but undeniably possessive touch. Flora shuddered and wished she had the ability to flee the place. When I call you by name, you tremble. Do not worry. He smiled, leaning even closer. You will get used to it. In time. Across the hall, Duncan stopped moving completely. Thorquill, who was beside him, followed his brother's gaze and saw exactly what Duncan saw. George Lennox, with his hand on Flora's arm, leaning too close, speaking too softly, while she remained rigid, her shoulders tense, her eyes downcast. Duncan, Thorquill began, his voice low and cautious, but Duncan was already moving. James, ever watchful, noticed as well and exchanged a quick look with Thorquill. He knew that look. Everyone who had served alongside Duncan Ross knew it. It was the look that preceded action, decision, violence when necessary. Duncan crossed the hall with measured but determined steps, and stopped directly behind George and Flora. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but charged with something dangerous. Mr. Lennox. George turned, his hand still on Flora's arm, and raised an eyebrow. Yes, Mr. Ross? The holly that Lady Flora is showing you is considered sacred in our lands. Traditionally, it must be gathered and braided only by women, as it is believed that male hands can curse the protection it offers. It was a lie. Flora knew it, but the way Duncan said it with that unshakable seriousness made it seem like absolute truth. George blinked, clearly surprised, and released Flora's arm. I did not know that. What an interesting tradition. Our traditions are ancient, Mr. Lennox, and we take respect for them very seriously." The double meaning was not missed. Flora saw George's jaw briefly tense, but he recovered quickly, smiling with that calculated elegance. "Of course, I meant no offense." Duncan nodded once, his eyes finally meeting Flora's, and in that look she saw everything, the promise, the protection, the silent war being waged for her sake. "Miss Flora," Duncan said, his voice softening only a fraction, "your presence would be valuable. At the table where they are preparing the candles, Nell was looking for you a moment ago." It was another lie, but this time Flora accepted with gratitude. "Of course, Laird Ross. Excuse me, Sir Lennox." She quickly moved away, crossing the hall toward the candle table, and only when she was surrounded by familiar and safe women did she allow her shoulders to relax. Flora remained helping the women for a few minutes, trying to keep calm, but soon she couldn't breathe. The air was too dense, too warm inside, heavy with voices and laughter that seemed to tighten around her throat like invisible hands. She could feel George's eyes on her, always on her, even when he pretended to pay attention to conversations with her father and the village elders. And she could feel Duncan's eyes too, but those were different. Those didn't suffocate her. Those made her want things she couldn't have. Nell worked beside her, braiding holly branches with skilled fingers, but she perceived the girl's discomfort. She leaned in discreetly and whispered, "You are pale, Flora. Do you need air?" Flora nodded, unable to trust her own voice. Nell quickly glanced around the hall. Angus was deeply engaged in a discussion with George and 3 of the oldest men in the village, gesticulating as he talked about the lands, the harvests, the alliances. He was completely distracted. "Go," Nell murmured, briefly squeezing Flora's hand. "No one will notice. And if they ask, will say you went to fetch more wax from the pantry." Flora did not need to be told twice. She carefully stood up, leaving the unfinished wax candle on the table, and walked toward the side door of the hall, the one that led to the narrow path to the village chapel. She kept her steps measured, as if she were merely completing some simple task, but her heart pounded erratically in her chest. No one stopped her. No one even looked, except Duncan, who saw her disappear through the side door, the green shawl slipping slightly from her shoulders as she moved. His fingers closed around the tankard of mead that Thorquil had offered him, but he did not drink. He just watched the place where she had disappeared, as if he could see through the wooden walls. Flora pushed the door open, and the cold night air hit her like a cold wave, stealing her breath. But it was exactly what she needed. She pulled the shawl tightly around her shoulders and walked quickly down the snow-covered path, moving away from the warmth and noise of the hall, from the voices and the stairs, from everything that bound and suffocated her. The village chapel was only 50 paces from the hall, hidden between 2 ancient oaks, whose bare branches reached up against the night sky like hands in prayer. It was an even older construction than the Thomson house, made of grey stone covered with moss and lichen, with a slate roof that had withstood winters for more than a century. It served the entire community, a place to meet God when human words were not enough. The night was freezing, the clear sky revealing thousands of stars scattered like diamonds on black velvet. The fresh snow crunched beneath her feet as she walked, her arms crossed over her chest, her breath forming white clouds in the frozen air. But Flora barely felt the cold. She felt only the tightness in her chest, the desperate need for something to remind her that she was still human, still, free, still herself. The chapel was small, barely larger than a room, with moss-covered stone walls and a slate roof that had resisted the winters for centuries. Flora pushed the wooden door, which creaked on its rusty hinges, and entered the dark, silent space. There was a single window on the opposite wall, narrow and tall, and it was there that the Yule candles were meant to be lit. Ancient tradition, light for the lost, hope for the desperate. Flora lit the candle with trembling hands, using the flint kept in a niche in the wall. The flame appeared small, wavering, but it grew, illuminating the interior of the chapel with a soft, golden glow. She placed the candle on the window ledge and stood there, watching the light dance against the darkness outside. "Please," she whispered to the void, to God, to whoever was listening, "please do not let me fall into his hands." "You won't." Flora spun around so fast, she almost knocked over the candle. Duncan Ross stood at the chapel entrance, silhouetted against the night, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He did not move. He only stood there, his grey eyes fixed on her, and Flora felt something inside her completely unravel. How did you find me? I saw you leave. He took a step inside and the door closed softly behind him. You shouldn't be here alone. It is not safe. And are you? The words came out before she could stop them, charged with an emotion she couldn't name. Safe? Duncan paused and something passed over his face, something close to pain. No, I'm not. Silence settled between them, dense and heavy. Flora could hear her own breathing, quick and irregular, mixed with the distant sound of the wind outside. I do not like the way he looks at you. The words came low, deep, charged with an intensity that made Flora's heart race. And what would be the correct way? The question came out as a whisper, but in the stillness of the chapel it sounded too loud, too profane. Duncan took a step toward her, then another, his movements slow and deliberate, like someone approaching something sacred they fear defiling. The distance between them shrank until Flora could feel the heat radiating from his body, cutting through the night cold that seeped in through the ancient stones. The candle flame danced between them, casting shadows that made Duncan's face even more sculpted, as if carved from mountain granite. But his eyes, his grey eyes burned with something that made her heart pound. The one that does not seek to possess you. His voice dropped even lower, husky, intimate, as if they were sharing secrets the world should not hear. But to earn you. Flora felt her legs weaken. Her hands found the edge of the stone table where the candle rested, seeking support, an anchor. She tried to smile, as if these were just words tossed to the wind, but her mouth trembled, betraying everything she tried to hide. What do you see when you look at me, then? Duncan inhaled deeply, and Flora saw his chest expand beneath the tartan. He took another step, eliminating the last remnant of safe distance between them, and now they were so close that she had to lift her chin to keep looking into his eyes. His scent enveloped her, leather, wood smoke, and something wild that belonged to the mountains and the cold highland winds. I see a woman who was not born to be any man's promise. Every word came out, charged with contained emotion, with truths that cost blood to speak. You came into the world to be a choice. He slowly raised his hand, so slowly that Flora could see every muscle move, every tendon tense. His fingers trembled slightly as they paused in the air, a few inches from her cheek, as if an invisible barrier prevented him from crossing that final distance. And, God help me, his voice broke, just a fraction. But Flora heard it. I feel I have already made mine. The gust air left her lungs all at once. For an infinite instant, they remained suspended in time, looking into each other's eyes in a silence that said more than any words ever could. Flora saw the strength in him, the honor, the iron control that kept him still when every line of his body screamed to move. There was something wild about him, like a lion from ancient legends, raw power contained by choice, not by weakness. And Duncan saw in her everything he thought was lost in the world. Purity that was not naivete, kindness that was not weakness, beauty that went far beyond the delicate face illuminated by the trembling candle flame. He saw the way her lips slightly parted, how her breath came quick and irregular, how her blue eyes widened not with fear but with recognition. She felt it too. He knew. Flora stepped back half a pace, not because she wanted distance, but because the desire to eliminate any space between them was so overwhelming that it frightened her. Her voice was so low that he had to lean in even closer to hear. Do not say that, Mr. Duncan Ross. Her hands clenched against the skirt of her gown, looking for something to hold on to that wasn't his shoulders. Not when the world has me trapped on all sides. Duncan lowered the hand that still hovered in the air between them, but he did not retreat. His eyes swept over her face like someone memorizing every detail before a battle from which they might not return. Then let me break the chains. It was not a plea, it was a vow. The promise hung suspended between them in the cold chapel air, heavy as iron, beautiful as melted gold. Flora closed her eyes, feeling tears burn behind her eyelids, and when she opened them again, he was still there, immobile, waiting, as if he had all the time in the world, as if there was nothing more important than that moment, that tiny space between their bodies where entire destinies were being decided. You cannot, she whispered, and a single tear escaped, slowly tracing a path down her cheek. My father has already decided, and I have no choice. We all have a choice, Flora. He said her name as if it were a prayer murmured at a sacred altar, as if it were the only word that mattered in all the languages ever spoken. Duncan leaned in slightly, and Flora felt his breath brush against her hair, warm against her temple. "Even when the whole world conspires against us," he continued, his voice so low it was almost a contained growl, "we still have a choice, and mine is already made." Flora lifted her eyes, meeting his in that impossible proximity, and something passed between them. It was not just attraction, it was a recognition of souls, as if they had searched for each other for entire lifetimes, and finally met in the most unlikely place, at the most impossible time. She wanted to answer. She wanted to say that she, too, had made her choice the moment her eyes met his on. That misty morning, when he held her in his arms for a few seconds that were worth more than whole years, she wanted to say that she saw in him not just protection, but freedom, the kind of freedom that comes from being chosen, not negotiated. But the words caught in her throat, trapped by fear, duty, honor. They stood there so close that Flora could see the variations of blue and grey in his eyes, could count every dark strand of his beard, could feel the warmth of his body as if it were living fire. His woody scent and the snow in his hair mingled with hers, lavender and honey that Nell insisted on using in the washing waters, and Duncan breathed in her scent like a thirsty man drinks water, engraving it somewhere deep where no winter could ever reach. The silence between them was precious, sacred, loaded with everything they could not say, but that their bodies screamed in a language older than words. Then, slowly, as if each movement cost him pieces of his soul, Duncan stepped back. Then another. The distance grew again between them, cold and cruel. "I will protect you, Flora Thomson." His voice was firmer now, charged with a determination that came from places where promises were sealed with blood. "Even if you do not allow me to, even if you hate me for it." He paused at the door threshold, silhouetted against the starry night, and for one last instant his eyes met hers across the space that separated them. "I will protect you." And then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness like a shadow, leaving only the sound of his footsteps in the snow and the ghost of his warmth in the cold chapel air. Flora remained there, alone with the candle that continued to burn, her legs trembling so much she had to lean on the stone table. She brought her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat so hard it hurt, and closed her eyes. She could still feel his warmth. She could still smell his scent. She could still feel the weight of those eyes on her skin, as if they were hands. And for the first time since her father had announced the marriage to George Lennox, Flora felt something other than despair. She felt hope, dangerous, impossible, devastating, but hope nonetheless. The following morning dawned grey and heavy, with low clouds that promised snow before nightfall. Flora woke with swollen eyes, the consequence of a restless night where she relived every second of those moments in the chapel. Duncan's voice still echoed in her mind like a distant bell, and she could swear she still felt his warmth in the air around her, a phantom of a proximity that should never have happened, but now refused to fade. She dressed slowly, choosing a simple wool gown and tying her hair in a loose braid that fell over her shoulder. When she went down to the kitchen, she found Nell already preparing breakfast, her face marked by poorly disguised worry. "You slept badly again, my girl." It was not a question. Flora merely nodded, accepting the mug of hot tea Nell offered her and sitting on the bench by the fireplace. "Your father left early with Sir Lennox. They went to the northern lands to inspect the boundaries. They will be out all day." Flora felt relief flood her chest. A whole day without having to face George's dark eyes, without feeling that possessive touch, that suffocating presence. A day to breathe. "And you," Nell continued, pointing her wooden spoon at her, "with maternal authority, are going to take advantage of this to clear your head. You are too pale, too thin. You need sun and fresh air. Nell, it is about to snow." "So what? Snow never killed anyone in the Highlands. What kills is staying trapped indoors, brooding over thoughts that lead nowhere." Flora did not have the energy to argue. She finished her tea in silence, ate half a piece of bread with butter and honey, and let Nell wrap her in layers of wool and tartan until she looked like a clumsy little bear. When she finally stepped out the back door, the cold air cut into her lungs, but it was exactly what she needed. She walked without a clear destination, her feet naturally carrying her toward the forest that marked the western boundary of the Thomson lands. There, among the ancient pines and stripped oaks, The world seemed quieter, purer. The previous day's snow covered everything with a thin but uniform layer, and Flora watched her own footprints form behind her, temporary marks that the next wind would erase. She did not realize how long she walked. She just kept going, lost in thoughts that always revolved around the same things. George's promise, the golden cage that awaited her, and Duncan Ross's grey eyes that seemed to see through her, inside her, beyond her. It was when she reached the clearing that she stopped. The place was small, surrounded by tall pine trees that formed an almost perfect circle. In the center, there, was an ancient stone covered with lichen and moss that the elders said was an altar from olden times, when other beliefs governed these lands. Flora had always loved this spot. She came here as a child when her mother was still alive, and they would sit together on that stone while telling stories of fairies and warriors. But today, she was not alone. Duncan Ross stood there by the stone, his shoulders covered by the dark Ross tartan, his long black hair slightly tousled by the wind. He held something in his hands. Holly branches, Flora realized, probably cut for the Yule decorations. Hearing her, he turned, and their eyes met across the snowy distance. Neither spoke for long seconds. Flora should turn back. She should go home, to the safety of duty and obedience. But her feet would not move. She stood there, at the edge of the clearing, like a doe that meets a wolf, but cannot run. "Miss Flora," his voice broke the silence, deep and careful. "I did not expect to find you here." "Nor I you, Mr. Ross." He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if remembering the promise he had made to himself to maintain distance, at least for now. The holly branches were still in his hands, the red berries gleaming against the dark green of the leaves. "Is this place yours?" Flora asked, searching for something safe to say, something that wouldn't lead them back to that dangerous proximity of the night before. "No, it belongs to the Thomson lands, but it is on the boundary." "And," he hesitated, his eyes briefly looking away before returning to her, "and I knew you came here. I have seen you a few times, discreetly over the years, always alone, always at peace." Something tightened in Flora's chest at the thought of Duncan watching her from afar, keeping those moments as secrets. How many times had she been here without knowing she was seen? How many times had she thought she was alone when, in fact, those intense, mysterious eyes were following her? "I did not know I was watched." "It was not watching, Flora." He said her name low, too intimate for the daylight. "It was protection. These woods are not always safe, and you came unaccompanied. For years. For years." Silence returned, but it was different now, loaded with revelations, with time shared without their knowing, with a proximity that existed long before that meeting on the muddy street. Flora took a step toward the center of the clearing, toward him, and then another. Her feet trod the fresh snow softly, but when she reached an area where ice had formed beneath the white layer, her foot slipped. It happened too fast for her to react. One moment she was standing, the next the world was spinning, and she was falling. But she did not reach the ground. Strong arms gripped her shoulders, pulling her against a solid chest, and Flora felt the impact steal all the air from her lungs, not from the averted fall, but from the warmth that suddenly enveloped her, from the scent of wood smoke and leather, from the feeling of absolute security that took hold of her when she found herself within Duncan Ross's arms. He held her tightly, his large hands grasping her arms through the layers of wool, and Flora could feel every finger, every point of pressure, as if they were branded onto her skin with hot iron. She raised her face and found herself inches from his, so close she could see the tiny lines around his. Eyes could count every dark strand of his beard, could feel his breath mingling with hers in the cold air. The wind chose that moment to blow harder, lifting Flora's shawl and making her hair escape from the braid, red strands dancing between them like living flames. Duncan did not move. He just held her, his eyes fixed on hers, his jaw tense with the effort of containment that she could feel vibrating in every muscle of his body. "Lass." The word came out husky, almost a contained groan. "One day I shall beg forgiveness for touching you when I should not." Flora took a deep breath, or tried to, but the air did not properly reach her lungs. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain he could feel it against his own chest. "And why? Should you not?" Duncan closed his eyes, as if the simple act of looking at her was torture. His fingers tightened slightly on her arms, not hard enough to hurt, but enough for her to feel the tremor in them, the battle he was fighting with himself. Because, Flora, he opened his eyes again, and what she saw there left her breathless. Desire, pain, containment that cost blood. If I start, I do not know how to stop. The world stopped spinning. Flora knew she should pull away. She knew that every second there in his arms was a betrayal to her father, to the promise made, to the future that was already decided. But her body would not obey. She stayed there, suspended in that impossible moment, feeling his firmness and warmth through the layers of clothing, the weight of that gaze that consumed her completely. Duncan. His name escaped her lips like a plea, like a prayer, and she saw something break in him when he heard it. He released her so suddenly that Flora almost lost her balance again. He took 2 steps back, then 3, putting a safe distance between them, but his breathing came quick and irregular, betraying everything he tried to hide. Flora brought her hand to her chest, feeling her racing heart beneath her fingers, and tried to control her own breath. She couldn't. She just stood there, looking at him across the distance that seemed at once too vast and too small. "I apologize," Duncan said, his voice still husky but more controlled. I should not have. Do not apologize." The words came out firm, firmer than Flora felt. "You saved me from falling. That is not what I almost failed to save you from." The raw truth in his words hit her like a blow. Flora opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. What could she say? That she felt it too? That she also fought against something that grew within her, with every glance, every word, every stolen moment? She said nothing. She only turned and began to walk back, her steps hurried, her heart still pounding erratically. But before she left the clearing, she heard his voice, low but clear in the stillness of the forest. "Flora." She stopped, but did not turn around. "He does not deserve you." Flora closed her eyes, feeling tears burn, but she did not let them fall. When she opened them again, she continued walking, leaving Duncan alone in the clearing with the holly branches forgotten in the snow. What neither of them saw was the dark figure watching from between the more distant trees. George Lennox had returned earlier from the northern lands and had decided to ride alone through the Thomson properties, familiarizing himself with what would soon be his by right of marriage. He had seen everything: the slip, the touch, the proximity, the way Duncan Ross held Flora as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And something inside George ignited. It was not love. It had never been love. It was possession. It was wounded pride. It was the primal need to win, to take, to prove that what others desired belonged to him. He turned his horse with a sharp pull on the reins and galloped back to the main house, his mind already working on plans, strategies, moves that would guarantee his victory. If Angus did not anticipate the announcement of the engagement, George would force him to do so, and if Duncan Ross thought he could claim Flora Thomson with glances and whispered promises, he would quickly learn that some men fight with swords, others fight with power, and George Lennox had power to spare. That night, during dinner, George raised the subject with the delicacy of one wielding a blade hidden in silk. "Angus, my friend," he began, reclining in his chair with studied elegance, "I have been giving much thought to our alliance, and to the need to formalize it before the winter deepens." Angus looked up from his food, surprised. "Formalize?" "The engagement, of course." George smiled, but his eyes remained cold, calculating. "Yule is approaching. What better time to announce before the whole clan that Flora and I are promised? We could even formalize our union. And she would return home with me then as my wife. It would be a double celebration, the renewal of winter and the birth of our union." Flora, sitting on the other side of the table, felt the blood freeze in her veins. Her hands clenched around her fork so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Father," she began, but Angus raised his hand, silencing her. "It is an interesting suggestion, George, but there is protocol to follow, contracts to be signed, dowries to be negotiated. All of that can be resolved quickly between men of honor." George leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Angus with persuasive intensity. "We are not talking about mutual distrust, are we? We are talking about uniting our families under the eyes of God and the community. The sooner the stronger the message we send to those who would question our alliance." There was malice disguised as honey in those words, a veiled threat, a subtle pressure. Angus was no fool. He perfectly understood what George was insinuating. If he did not act fast, others might try to interfere. Others, like Duncan Ross, whose gaze upon Flora during the night at the community hall had not gone unnoticed by the more attentive eyes. "I will consider your proposal, George. Do not delay too long, my friend." George picked up his wineglass, raising it in a silent toast. Winter is unpredictable, and it would be terrible if something disrupted our plans. Flora stood up so abruptly that her chair almost tipped over backwards. "Excuse me, I'm not feeling well." She left before anyone could stop her, climbing the stairs with footsteps that echoed like war drums. When she reached her room and locked the door, she collapsed onto the bed, her entire body trembling, not from cold, from fear, from anger, from desperation, and from something more dangerous, hope, that impossible hope that Duncan Ross had planted in her heart, and which now refused to die, no matter how much she tried to suffocate it. Would there be hope for her? Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering the highlands with its white mantle, and somewhere beyond the hills, Duncan Ross looked out the window of the Ross Tower house, watching the flakes fall, unable to shake the feeling of Flora in his arms. The storm was only just beginning, and no one would emerge unscathed. The 3 days leading up to the start of Yule were the most intense Flora had ever experienced. The entire village buzzed with preparations, each family contributing what they could to ensure the celebration, honored both ancient traditions and the faith that now guided their hearts. The air smelled of fresh pine, wood smoke, and the sweet bread baking in every oven, flavored with honey and precious spices, saved all year for this moment. Flora woke on the morning of the first day of preparations with a heavy heart. The conversation during dinner the night before still echoed in her mind. George pressuring her father, Angus considering, she herself feeling increasingly like a piece in a game she did not fully understand but could not escape. She dressed in a practical dark green wool gown, tied her hair in a thick braid that fell down her back, and went downstairs to find Nell already up organizing baskets and cloths. "Today we will help finalize the preparation of the candles for all the village windows," Nell announced, handing her a basket filled with beeswax, linen, wicks and small clay pots. "And you will smile, Flora Thomson, even if you have to pretend. The children deserve to see joy, not sorrow." Flora forced a smile that did not reach her eyes, but Nell accepted it nonetheless. They went out together toward the community hall, where dozens of women were already gathered, the tables covered with all the necessary materials to create the candles that would light up Yule. The work was meticulous, melting the wax to the exact temperature, repeatedly dipping the wicks until perfect cylinders formed, adding aromatic herbs that Nell swore kept the restless spirits of winter at bay. Flora lost herself in the rhythm of the work, her hands moving automatically as she talked with the other women, heard their laughter, participated in their stories. There was something comforting in that female community, in that wisdom shared across generations. For moments, she managed to forget George Lennox and his veiled threats. For moments she was just Flora, making candles with the hands her mother had used, honoring traditions her grandmother had honored. But then George appeared. He arrived at the hall near noon, accompanied by Angus, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. Flora felt the change even before she saw him, a tension settling in her shoulders, a tightness in her stomach. When she looked up and found that dark gaze fixed on her, the smile she had managed to maintain vanished. George crossed the hall directly toward her, ignoring the other women, ignoring even Nell, who watched him with poorly disguised disapproval. "Lady Flora, what an enchanting scene." His voice was poisoned honey. "So dedicated to the traditions of your people." "They are my traditions too, Mr. Lennox." Flora kept her eyes on the candles, refusing to look at him directly. "Of course, and soon you will learn new traditions from the south." He extended his hand, as if expecting her to take it. When Flora did not move, he slowly lowered it, his smile growing tighter. "Your father and I spoke this morning about the announcement, about formalities that need to be expedited." Flora's heart plummeted, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "My father has not informed me of anything." "Not yet, but he will." George leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "And when he does, I hope you demonstrate more enthusiasm than you have shown so far. It would be a shame for our alliance to begin under clouds of reluctance." There was a threat in those words. Flora heard it clearly. Before she could respond, Nell inserted herself between them with the subtlety of an enraged bull. "Mr. Lennox, with all due respect, you are hindering our work. The wax cools quickly and we have dozens of candles yet to make." George backed away, but his eyes never left Flora. "Of course, I did not mean to interrupt." He made a minimal bow. "Until later, Miss Flora." Only when he left could Flora breathe again. Her hands trembled so much that Nell had to take the candle she held before she dropped it. "That man," Nell muttered, too low for the others to hear. "There is something wrong with him. Something my bones feel." Flora did not answer. She merely returned to work, dipping the wick into the melted wax with mechanical movements, trying not to think about the future that approached like an inevitable storm. While the women worked on the candles, the men left for the traditional hunt. In the Highlands, securing fresh meat for the Yule period was a male responsibility, and the clans often hunted together, transforming necessity into a ritual of unity. Duncan Ross led the men of the Ross clan, while Angus commanded the Thomsons, but tradition dictated that on the eve of Yule, even ancient rivals hunted side by side. George Lennox, naturally, insisted on participating. They rode toward the northern forests, where the deer were still descending from the mountains in search of food before the heaviest snowfalls. Duncan rode ahead, his black horse moving with the same powerful restraint as its owner. Thorquill and James Smith flanked him, while Angus and George came right behind, accompanied by 6 more men from the village. The hunt was silent, tense. Duncan brought down a magnificent stag with a single arrow, the animal falling without prolonged suffering, and the men worked together to prepare it for transport. It was during this work that George approached Duncan directly for the first time. "Impressive skill, Ross." The voice was too polite, too controlled. Duncan cleaned the blade of his shin doob in the snow before tucking it into his boot. "I grew up in these lands, Lennox. I know every tree, every trail, and every family, I imagine." George paused, observing Duncan with calculating eyes. "Including the Thomsons." Duncan finally looked at him, and the air between the 2 men became charged enough that Thorquill, a few yards away, tensed up. "I have known the Thomsons for generations. Good people, honorable." "I wholeheartedly agree." George smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile. "That is why I am so eager to unite our families. Miss Flora will be an exemplary wife." Duncan's fingers closed around the handle of the bow he was holding, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. A woman like Flora Thomson deserves more than to be acquired in a political agreement. "Interesting." George tilted his head like a bird studying its prey. "I did not know you had such strong opinions about other people's marriages." "I have strong opinions about injustice." "Injustice?" George took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Or envy?" Thorquill appeared at Duncan's side at that moment, his hand landing on his shoulder with a warning squeeze. James Smith also approached, positioning himself between the 2 men with the calm authority of one who has lived long enough to recognize when violence is about to erupt. "Gentlemen," James said, his voice deep but calm, "we have meat to transport and a Yule to prepare. Save your strength for the celebrations." Duncan backed down first, but his eyes never left George. When he finally turned and walked toward the horses, Thorquill followed him. "You are going to end up killing that man before Yule is over," Thorquill muttered. "Only if he gives me reason." Duncan, "I know." Duncan mounted his horse with a fluid motion. "I know." But both knew that knowing the limits and respecting them were 2 different things. In the afternoon, when the men returned with the deer, the entire village gathered for the cutting of the Yule log. It was an ancient tradition to choose the largest, strongest trunk that could burn throughout the feast night, symbolizing the light resisting the darkness, the life surviving the winter. Flora was among the women watching. When she saw Duncan and her father work together to drag the enormous oak trunk that had been chosen, their muscles strained with the effort, but there was something ritualistic about the work, something that transcended mere physical preparation. It was when Angus paused, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold, that he looked at Duncan and then at Flora, who was a few yards away. He saw the way Duncan's eyes instinctively moved toward her. He saw the way Flora, even trying not to look, still did, stealing glances when she thought no one noticed. And Angus understood. That night, after dinner, the village gathered for the first Seilith, the social dance that marked the beginning of the celebrations. The community hall was transformed. Candles illuminated every corner, wreaths of holly and yew hung from the rafters, and in the center, musicians tuned their bagpipes, fiddles, and even an ancient clarsach that had belonged to someone's grandfather. Flora wore her best gown, dark blue wool embroidered with silver threads on the sleeves and neckline, a gift from her mother years ago. Nell tied her hair in an elaborate style, leaving a few loose strands that framed her face. When she descended the stairs and entered the hall, she felt the weight of all eyes on her. But only one mattered. Duncan was near the fireplace, talking with James and other clan men, but when she entered, his head turned as if pulled by an invisible string. His eyes found hers across the crowded hall, and even with all that distance, Flora felt the impact as if it were physical touch. He did not smile. He just looked, and swallowed hard. But in that look was everything. George appeared beside her almost immediately, offering his arm. "Miss Flora, you look stunning tonight." His hand covered hers before she could refuse. "Would I have the honor of dancing with me when the music begins?" Flora wanted to refuse. She wanted to pull her hand away from his. But her father was watching from the other side of the hall, and she knew that refusing would create a scandal she could not allow. "Of course, Mr. Lennox." The music began, a traditional reel, fast and joyful. George guided her to the center of the hall, where other couples were already forming lines. The dance required them to constantly switch partners, spinning, intertwining hands, moving to the frenetic rhythm of the bagpipes and fiddle. Flora tried to lose herself in the music, in the joy around her, and for moments she succeeded. She danced with elders who made her laugh with exaggerated steps, with young boys who stumbled over their own feet, with women who twirled their skirts as if they were still 20. And then the music changed. A slower, more intimate strathspey. The couples rearranged, and Flora felt George approaching again, claiming her. His hand landed on her waist with a pressure that was not an invitation, but a declaration of ownership. They began to move, and Flora kept her eyes downcast, focused on the silver brooch on his chest, refusing to meet his gaze. But George would not allow it. "Look at me, Flora." It was not a request. It was an order. She slowly raised her eyes, and what she saw there chilled her completely. It was not admiration. It was something else. It was the absolute certainty of victory. "I brought something for you." He released one of her hands just long enough to take something from the inside pocket of his coat. A brooch, gold and emeralds, beautifully crafted, clearly expensive. "A gift for my future wife." Flora stopped moving, even with the music still playing around them. "Mr. Lennox, I thank you, but I cannot accept something that does not correspond to my heart." His smile grew colder, tighter. "Hearts change, Lady Flora, sometimes by reason." He leaned closer, his voice lowering so only she could hear. "Sometimes by necessity." His eyes moved briefly toward Angus, who was talking with other elders near the entrance. A veiled threat, a reminder that Flora's fate was not hers alone. Flora felt nausea rise in her throat. She pulled away from him with an abrupt step, even as the music continued to play. "Excuse me." She crossed the hall full of people dancing and talking with full-throated laughter, heading for the side door, looking for air, space, anything that wasn't those dark eyes and that suffocating pressure. But when she reached the door, a hand touched her elbow lightly. She turned, her heart racing, and found Duncan. He said nothing. He simply guided her gently out of the hall, onto the small side patio, where the night air was freezing but clean, free from the smoke and oppressive heat inside. The music still played behind them, muffled by the stone walls, but here there was silence. Duncan released her as soon as they were away from curious eyes, maintaining a respectful distance, but his eyes burned with something that went far beyond casual concern. "Do not accept anything else from him, not even words." His voice came out low, husky, charged with something dangerously close to jealousy. Flora should be offended by the order. She should challenge him for his presumption, but she couldn't. "And what should I accept from you, Mr. Ross?" Duncan took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort of containment. When he spoke again, his voice was even, lower, more intimate. "The truth." "What truth?" He took a step toward her, closing some of the distance, and Flora saw his hand rise, fingers almost touching her face before stopping in the air, trembling slightly. Mo Krieg. The Gaelic words came out like a caress. The truth is that every time he touches you, I have to use all my strength not to tear him away from you. Flora felt the air leave her lungs. The truth is that I see you in every thought, in every silent moment, in every fraction of a second before sleep. His hand finally descended but did not touch her face. It lightly touched her mother's brooch that Flora wore on her shawl, an indirect, safe touch, but one that still made her tremble. Agreed, you should not be his, not when your heart beats differently when you are near me. Do not lie, Flora, I can see it. And she could not lie, because it was true. Her heart beat differently, her breathing changed, her whole body recognized his presence in a way it would never recognize George Lennox. Duncan, his name came out as a sigh. Say it again. His eyes burned. Say my name again. Duncan. He closed his eyes, as if hearing his name in her voice was pain and pleasure mingled. When he opened them again, there was resolve there. Promise. War. I will not let him take you, Mo Nigendon. Not without a fight. Not without offering you a choice your father refuses to give you. Before Flora could respond, the door opened. Thorquill appeared, his face tense. Duncan, Lennox is looking for Miss Flora, and he does not look happy. Duncan immediately stepped away from her, but his eyes remained fixed on hers for another second. Go back inside. I will be watching. Flora nodded, unable to trust her own voice, and allowed Thorquill to escort her back into the hall. When she entered, she found George waiting, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes burning with ill-contained rage. And Flora knew, in that moment, that the storm was about to break, that George Lennox would not wait for the Yule feast, that he would make his move sooner, and that, when he did, blood might be spilled. The morning before the Yule feast dawned with a leaden sky, a sign of heavy snow that the elders said could last for days. Flora woke with a weight in her chest she could not name, as if her body knew something her mind had not yet grasped. She dressed slowly, choosing a simple gown of wine-colored wool, and went downstairs to find the house in unusual silence. Nell was in the kitchen, but her face carried worry. Your father asked to speak with you. He's in the study. Flora's heart quickened. She crossed the hall with steps that echoed too loudly against the cold stone and knocked on the study door with trembling fingers. Enter. Angus was standing by the window, his hands crossed behind his back, watching the dark clouds gather over the hills. He did not turn when she entered. Sit down, Flora. She obeyed, her hands clasped in her lap, waiting. The silence stretched, heavy and dense, until her father finally spoke. I spent the night awake, thinking, about alliances, about protection, about what is best for our family. He paused, his voice laden with weariness. And about what is right. Flora barely dared to breathe. I saw how George Lennox looks at you. I saw how you do not look at him the same way. You seem afraid of him. Angus finally turned, and his eyes were red, as if he had wept or not slept or both. I also saw how Duncan Ross looks at you, and how you return the look. Father, let me finish. He raised his hand, and Flora fell silent. I am a practical man, Flora. I always have been. I believed political alliances were the way to our survival. But last night, watching you dance, I saw your mother. I saw the way she looked when I courted her, when we still had a choice. His voice broke slightly, and I realized I was about to deny you what she and I had, what every woman deserves to have. Tears burned Flora's eyes. I am not good with sentimental words, my daughter, but I love you. You know that. I do not want to impose a life of sadness and fear on you. I will refuse Lennox's proposal, today before the Yule feast. On the other side of the door, hidden in the corridor where the shadows were densest, George Lennox was completely still. He had arrived early, looking for Angus to discuss the final details of the agreement, when he had heard voices coming from the study. He had approached, curious, and then he listened. Every word was like a dagger plunged into his pride. His fingers slowly closed around the handle of the cane he carried, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. Something dark was forming in his eyes. It was not just anger. It was cold, calculated, dangerous hatred. Hatred for being refused. Hatred for losing to the cursed Highlander. Hatred for having his plan undone by foolish sentimentality. He retreated silently, his steps making no sound against the stone, and disappeared down the side corridor. But his mind was already working, already planning, already constructing a solution that would guarantee his victory. If Angus Thomson thought he could simply refuse, he would learn that some men do not accept defeat. Inside the study, oblivious to the presence that had been watching them, Angus continued, "Is there something between you and Duncan Ross?" The question came out direct without beating around the bush. Flora hesitated, her cheeks flushing slightly. "No, father. There is nothing between us. We only spoke a few times." The man muttered thoughtfully. "But has he shown interest in you? Does he have honorable intentions?" "Yes." The answer came out low, almost ashamed. "He has." Angus took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing as if a huge weight had been removed. "Then there is hope. Good hope. He is a noble man, courageous and of good intentions. Respected and loved by the clans, he has shown his worth countless times." He approached, placing his hand on his daughter's shoulder gently. "You may go, Flora. Later I will speak with Lennox. I will decline the request with all due courtesy, but with firmness. You will not marry him." Flora stood up so quickly she almost knocked over the chair. She threw her arms around her father's neck, hugging him, with a force he had not expected. "Thank you, father, thank you." Angus returned the embrace, his eyes closing briefly. "Go. Enjoy the day. Tomorrow we begin Yule with true joy." Flora left the study floating. It seemed the whole world had changed in a matter of minutes. The weight she had carried for weeks had simply disappeared, replaced by a lightness that made her want to laugh, dance, shout for joy. She spent the following hours helping Nell with the final preparations. She folded wool blankets that would be distributed to the village's poorest, placed fresh candles in all the house's windows, added wood to the fire until the flames danced high and warm. Every task was done with a smile on her lips, a light heart, and hope blossoming in her chest. "You are radiant today," Nell commented, observing her with sharp eyes. "Did your father speak with you?" "He did." Flora spun around, her dress whirling around her. "And everything is going to be fine, Nell. Finally, everything will be fine." When she finished her chores, Flora grabbed her thickest shawl and went out the back door. She needed air, space, a moment to absorb everything that had changed. Her feet naturally led her toward the woods, toward the small lake that froze every winter, creating an ice surface so clear it reflected the sky like a mirror. It was her place of peace. It always had been. The snow fell in light flakes, dancing in the air before landing softly on the already covered ground. Flora walked among the trees, breathing the icy air that burned her lungs but made her feel alive, truly alive. She reached the lake's edge and stopped, watching the ice gleam under the diffused light that pierced the clouds. She closed her eyes, lifting her face to the sky, and smiled. Free. Finally, free. She remained there for countless minutes, just allowing herself to feel the soft taste of freedom, joy, hope. Her plea for a miracle had been answered. She was truly happy. And so immersed in her atmosphere of gratitude and peace, Flora did not notice the footsteps behind her until the distance between her and danger had already vanished. An arm suddenly emerged, wrapping around her tightly and covering her mouth before she could react. The shock stole her breath, and her first impulse was to fight, but the aggressor's strength immobilized her before she could break free. George Lennox's voice, low and controlled, sounded too close. "Silence, Flora, do not make this harder." The phrase filled her with dread, more than any direct threat could. Flora tried to scream again, a firm, desperate plea for help that escaped between the fingers, attempting to silence her. The sound echoed, sharp, and a few birds took flight from the surrounding trees. It was enough to irritate George. Two men emerged from the woods, shadows she recognized only by their cloaks and trained silence. One of them wrapped a light cloth over her mouth, reducing her calls to whispers lost in the wind. The other helped lead her away, despite her stubborn resistance with every step. "Let's go," George said, with a calm that wounded, "before someone hears more than they should." They crossed the freshly fallen snow to where the horses awaited beneath pines dripping with frost. Flora felt her heart beat like a war drum, every pulse a protest. Tears ran down her face, fear dominating her. Yet, she was laid over the saddle, without delicacy, with the same determination of one who conducts something decided long before it is announced. George mounted behind her, firm enough to prevent any leap. "Ahead," he ordered the men. "I will meet you in the northern woods, but stay away from the cabin." She tried to call for help, but only muffled sounds emerged. George spurred his horse, and they vanished into the forest, the snow beginning to cover their tracks almost as quickly as they were made. On the other side of the lands on the properties adjacent to the village, Duncan rode calmly beside Thorquil. They had spent the morning checking the borders, ensuring everything was in order before Yule. The conversation flowed easily between the brothers, punctuated by occasional laughter and plans for the celebrations that would begin the next day. "Do you think Angus will really give his daughter to Lennox?" Thorquil asked, guiding his horse around a fallen log. "I don't know. But if he doesn't refuse—" Duncan left the sentence unfinished, but Thorquil perfectly understood what was unsaid. "You will fight for her." It was not a question. Duncan merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. That was when they saw the boy. He was running as if the devil were at his heels, stumbling in the snow, his eyes wide with terror. Duncan immediately pulled the reins, the horse stopping with a whinny. "Lad," Duncan called, dismounting with a fluid motion. "What happened?" The boy nearly collided with him, gasping, the words coming out brokenly. "Sir, Mr. Ross, I saw... Thorquil also dismounted, approaching with a look of concern that quickly turned into an attempt at levity. "Calm yourself, lad. Did you see a bodak in the woods? Or perhaps the Kalik of winter walking among the trees?" But the boy shook his head violently, tears beginning to run down his snow-smeared face. "No, sir, it was no spirit. It was men. 3 men. Duncan knelt before the boy, his hands resting on his shoulders with gentle firmness. "Breathe, and tell me exactly what you saw." The boy swallowed hard, trembling not just from the cold. I was in the woods, looking for fallen branches for firewood, and I heard screams, a woman's screams." He wiped his nose with his sleeve. "I hid behind the trees, and I saw 3 men, and they had Mr. Angus's daughter, the kind, red-haired young woman who gives us bread." The world stopped. Duncan felt every muscle in his body tense at once, transforming instantly from man to warrior. His fingers squeezed the boy's shoulders, not hard enough to hurt, but enough for the boy to know every word mattered. When was this?" Just a few minutes ago, sir. I came running as soon as they vanished to find help." "Which direction?" Duncan's voice was so low, so dangerous that the boy shivered. "North, sir. Towards the deep woods. She was terrified. Very scared." Ganthe tied a cloth over her mouth. New tears fell. "Please, Mr. Ross, please bring her back. The young lady is very good. She does not deserve—" Duncan was already standing, mounting his horse with a single, fluid motion. "Thorquil, I will go fetch James and more men. There is no time. James would find us here. He must already be on his way. Let him meet us alone. We go, the 2 of us. Now." Thorquil hesitated for only a fraction of a second before mounting too. He knew that tone. He knew that look. His brother was one step away from transforming into something he had only seen in battles, something primal, lethal, relentless. Duncan looked at the boy one last time. "Go to the village. Find Nell, the Thompson's maid. Tell her what you saw. Then find Angus. Tell him we are bringing Flora back." "Yes, sir." The boy ran off, and Duncan spurred his horse with a force that made the animal bolt. Thorquil followed him, and together they galloped north, towards the deep woods, following intuition, instinct, and something deeper Duncan did not dare name. The snow was falling harder now, but it did not matter. Nothing mattered, except finding her before it was too late. "Duncan!" Thorquil shouted over the wind. "They have a lead. Then we go faster." They leaned over the horses' necks, pushing them to the limit, and Duncan prayed that God was listening, that they would arrive in time. Because if they did not, no. He could not think about that. He had to arrive in time, he had to. His sharp gaze searched for every minor trace of footprints in the snow, anything to lead him in the right direction. In the abandoned cabin, hidden among dense pine trees and practically invisible to those who did not know the area, George dragged Flora inside. It was small, just one room with an unlit fireplace and some old furs tossed on the floor. It smelled of mold and abandonment. He removed the gag, then released her, and Flora staggered, almost falling. She turned to face him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her eyes wide with fear, but also with fury. "How dare you?" Her voice came out brokenly. "How dare you bring me here by force?" George closed the door, locking it with the wooden bar. When he turned, there was something dangerous in his eyes, something that went beyond political ambition. "I did not come to harm you, Flora. I am saving you, just ensuring that your future follows the right path." "Saving me?" She took a step back, but there was only a wall behind her. "This is wrong and dishonorable. It is a terrible trap. It is necessity." He approached, and she saw his hands begin to remove his gloves, fingers working the leather with disturbing calm. "Your father was going to refuse. He was going to hand you over to that interfering Highlander with little to offer besides muscles and foolish pride. I could not allow it. It is not my future you desire." Tears began to fall, but her voice remained firm. "It is to satisfy your pride. It is to prove you can control the destiny of others because of your selfish whims." George stopped, something crossing his face. Anger, perhaps, or a recognition of a truth he preferred not to admit. "You need to accept our engagement, Flora, and this must be resolved today." He gestured around the cabin. "You know how people talk, do you not, my dear? A young woman and a man seen together here. You know how rumors in the villages start." He smiled, and the smile was cruel. "Your reputation will be destroyed, unless I save it, unless we marry immediately, and you return with me to my lands as my wife." Flora felt nausea rise in her throat. She understood now. She understood the perfect trap he had built. Even if she returned safely to the village, the damage would be done. Tongues would wag, and in the Highlands, reputation was everything. Hers was lost. "You are a vile man." The words came out like arrows. "Vile and cowardly. My father offered you hospitality, honored you as a guest during our most sacred festival, and you repay him with this shameful and dishonorable attitude. Call it what you will." George removed his coat, took another step, now dangerously close, looking at her lewdly. "But soon we will be husband and wife. There is no more room for games or evasions." He reached out toward her face, and Flora flinched, turning her face away. George leaned his face toward hers, demanding she look at him. "Do not run from me. Release me. In time you will understand that resisting brings you no benefit." He moved even closer, his intentions becoming clearer and clearer in his gaze. "Soon you will understand." Flora pushed, kicked, fought with all the strength she had, but George was much stronger. He intercepted her when she tried to flee, blocking her exit. "Do not fight. You only make everything more difficult. Release me. Please release me." Tears were streaming down her delicate face. "There is no reason for such dread. You are overreacting." He moved closer still, trying to impose his proximity in a way she did not desire. Flora quickly turned her face away, her tears now falling freely. She felt when there would be no more escaping, and terror dominated her for an instant. It was the end. No one would come. No one would arrive in time. No one. The door burst open abruptly, the wooden bar, shattering under the brutal force of a timber log's impact. Duncan Ross entered like a human storm, snow and fury following in his wake. His eyes found Flora first, trapped, crying, her shawl askew, and then George, still blocking her every attempt to retreat. What crossed Duncan's face in that moment was not rage. It was something more primal, more devastating. It was divine wrath. "Take your filthy paws off her." Every word came out like a death sentence. George released Flora, immediately turning to face Duncan, and for the first time since everything began, beyond irritation, a flash of genuine fear crossed his eyes. He had gone too far. "What in the hell?" George began, trying to sound annoyed by the interruption, as if Duncan were an inconvenient intruder and not a righteous avenger. Duncan did not let him finish. The distance between them vanished in the blink of an eye, impossible speed for a man his size, and before George could react he was shoved, hard enough to crash against the wooden wall, which let out a low protest. George tried to get up, his hand instinctively going to the boot where he hid a dagger, but Duncan had already intercepted the movement, blocking his arm with a precision that betrayed years of real training. What followed was not a fight. It was a verdict. After a few long seconds where Lennox's attempts were all easily overcome by Duncan, the Highlander restrained him with more force, his eyes flashing with fury. Duncan gripped George's wrist one last time to ward off the threat, and a muffled sound escaped the man. The message was clear. That gesture was enough to remind George that he had dared to cross the worst possible boundary. Duncan then guided him to the floor with a firm, controlled motion, raising a faint trace of dust from the old planks. George tried to get up again, but Duncan held him down firmly, enough to prevent him from moving. The man's face showed the impact of the fall, but it was his pride that suffered most deeply. "Those hands," Duncan said, looking with calculated scorn at the fingers that still attempted to react, "thought they had any right over someone you shouldn't even look at." He grasped George's hand and wrenched it away with a sharp movement, pinning it under the weight of his boot, firm enough to make the man gasp and try to withdraw his fingers, as if the joints had been reminded of their limits. Just the clear understanding that this hand would not be used any time soon to impose fear on anyone. "If you insist on moving," Duncan said, his voice dropping to a register so low it seemed to vibrate in the cabin's wood, "I do not recommend you discover the extent of my patience." George swallowed hard. "You crossed every boundary an honorable man respects." Duncan brought his face closer, his eyes burning with something that was far beyond anger. It was ancestral conviction, the silent wrath of an entire land, rising up. "And you dared to touch what this land protects." George tried to speak, but the only thing that came out was a faint sound. Duncan merely continued, each word cutting like a sentence. "You scorned sacred hospitality. You betrayed the trust of one who opened his doors to you, and you tried to manipulate the honor of an entire family out of wounded pride. What you did will have severe consequences." He leaned his body in a little more, strong, imposing, like a warrior, and enough for George to understand that he was in control of absolutely nothing. "Believe me, Lennox, what you see now is simple restraint, and it is all you will receive from me today, because we are in the presence of a lady." The floor seemed to grow even colder beneath George. Even the wind outside seemed to fall silent to listen. The door, already damaged by Duncan's entry, creaked as Thorquill stepped in, followed by James. In seconds, they read the scene. Flora sheltered, though, shaken. George restrained and humiliated. Duncan standing tall like a contained hurricane. "Take him," Duncan ordered, without taking his eyes off George. His voice was cold, but firm as ancient stone. "He will answer before Angus Thomson and the elders. They will decide what is fitting for a vile man who dishonors his word. Tell them everything he did." Thorquill and James lifted George by the arms, and he did not resist. He no longer had the strength for it, neither physical nor moral. "And Lennox," Duncan took a single step forward, just enough for George to feel the weight of the warning. "If our paths should ever cross again." The threat hung suspended in the air. George nodded, unable to sustain the gaze, but feeling the throbbing in his hand as a reminder of his wrong choices. He was led out of the cabin, his protests muffled by the snow and wind outside. When silence returned, only Duncan and Flora remained, she trembling but saved, he still breathing, deeply, like one trying to master fury so as not to set the world on fire. And in that instant, without a word being spoken, Flora knew. No one would ever fight for her as Duncan Ross fought. Duncan finally turned to her, and Flora saw his expression change completely. The fury vanished, replaced by something so tender that it made new tears fall. "Mo Cree." He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. "Are you hurt? Did he... No," Flora whispered, her voice broken. "You arrived before... You arrived..." Her legs gave out. They simply gave out, and she began to fall before the whirlwind of intense emotions she was experiencing. But Duncan caught her. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, pulling her against his chest, and Flora clung to him, her fingers intertwining in his tartan as she sobbed against his shoulder. "I was so scared. I thought that..." Tears washed over her delicate face, and the crying finally broke through like a collapsing dam. "It is over, Agreed. You are with me now. You are safe, my dear. No one else will approach you like this. I swear on my life, on my clan, on everything I am. No one else will come near you with ill intentions." Flora rested her forehead on his neck, breathing in his scent, leather, snow, something wild and completely masculine that made her feel safer than any stone wall ever had. She could feel his heart beating strong against her chest, could feel the contained tremor in his muscles, could feel the heat radiating through him. From her hero, Duncan. She whispered his name against his skin and felt him shudder. "I am here. I will not leave you. Never again." He held her for long minutes, right there in the shattered cabin, while the snow fell outside and the world seemed to have stopped. And Flora, even through the fear and the tears, felt something more. She felt chosen. She felt protected. She felt loved, like one who finally finds her place in the world. When Duncan lowered her, it was only to remove his own tartan and wrap her in it, covering her, marking her with his colours, with his clan, with his promise and his honour. "Let us go home," he said softly, adjusting the fabric around her. "Your father is waiting." Flora nodded, unable to trust her own voice. She let Duncan carry her out of the cabin to where his horse was waiting, and when he lifted her onto the saddle and, mounted behind her, pulling her against his chest, she allowed herself to melt into that embrace. Riding back was like crossing a dream. The snow fell heavily now, covering everything, transforming the world into pure white. But Flora did not feel cold, not while she was wrapped in Duncan's arms, protected by the warmth of his body, safe in a way she had never felt before. "Mo nig hean don," he murmured against her hair, so low it was almost lost in the wind. "My brown-haired girl. You are mine now. If you will have me, if you want me." Flora closed her eyes, fresh tears mixing with the snow on her face, and she leaned her head against his chest. "I always wanted you," she whispered back. "Since the first moment I saw you, and you never left my thoughts." She felt his arms tighten around her, felt his breath catch for an instant, and she knew that, despite the terror, despite the pain, something good had been born from that darkness. Something true, something that not even the cruelest winter could freeze. Silently she closed her eyes and thanked the heavens for the miracle and for the chance to finally be truly happy in the arms of the man who won her heart at first sight. The journey back to the village was silent, but not empty. Duncan kept Flora wrapped in his arms throughout the ride, his tartan completely covering her, enveloping her with his mark, his scent, his protection. The snow continued to fall, transforming the world into a dreamscape, but Flora barely noticed it. She was aware only of the warmth of his body against hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his arms held her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever carried. When they finally sighted the first houses of the village, Flora saw the commotion. People were gathered near the communal hall, voices rising in heated discussion. Thorquil and James had already arrived with George, and by the looks of it, the news had spread like fire through dry straw. Duncan slowed the horse's pace, and Flora felt his arms tighten slightly around her. "Are you ready?" His voice was low, just for her. "I am, as long as you are with me." He did not reply with words. He merely gazed at those innocent blue eyes that so enchanted him, and decided to take her home, instead of exposing her to the gaze of everyone in that delicate moment. Then he simply tilted his head, briefly pressing his lips against the top of her head in a gesture so tender that new tears burned her eyes. They dismounted near the Thomson house, where Nell was already waiting at the door, her face pale with worry. Seeing Flora, she let out a sob of relief and ran, pulling the young woman into her arms with a force that almost knocked her down. "Child, thank God, thank God! I'm fine, Nell, I'm fine." Duncan watched the reunion with a gentle expression, but when Nell finally released Flora and looked at him, there was gratitude so profound in her eyes that it needed no words. "Thank you, Mr. Duncan Ross. Thank you for bringing her back." He merely nodded, then turned his eyes back to Flora. "I need to go to the hall. The council is meeting." Flora took a step toward him, taking his hand with both of hers. The touch was brief, appropriate, but laden with everything they could not say there, in front of witnesses. "Go, but come back soon." "Tha gala gamort," he whispered, so low only she heard. "I love you." Then he released her hand and turned, walking with determined steps toward the hall where justice would be served. In the great hall, the council of elders was already gathered. Grey-haired men with faces marked by time, representing every clan in the region, sat in a semicircle before the main fireplace. George Lennox stood in the center, flanked by Thorquil and James, his face still marked by the confrontation, but his posture trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Angus Thomson was among the elders, and when Duncan entered, their eyes met. Angus stood up immediately. My daughter, she is safe, home, with Nell. The tension left Angus's shoulders all at once, and he had to hold onto the chair to keep from swaying. Duncan crossed the hall and stood beside Thorquil, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on George with an intensity that made the Lowlander look away. The oldest elder, Malcolm MacLeod, struck his staff on the floor 3 times, calling, "Everyone's attention. George Lennox of the Lowlands, you stand before this council accused of kidnapping, of dishonoring sacred hospitality, and of profaning the Yule traditions." His voice was deep, weighted with authority earned over decades of leadership. "How do you answer?" George raised his chin, trying to appear offended. "There was a misunderstanding. I merely—" "Misunderstanding?" Angus exploded, stepping forward. "You were welcomed into my home as a guest of honor, and, when you realized we would decline the marriage proposal, you took my daughter by force. What misunderstanding can there be in that? She was reluctant to accept our union. I thought if we spoke away from unwanted influences—" "Influences?" Duncan also took a step forward, but James placed a hand on his shoulder, restraining him. "You call a father's honor influence? A woman's right to choose?" Malcolm struck his staff again. "Silence. Let the accused finish." But George had nothing more to say. He stood there, his mouth opening and closing, searching for justifications that did not exist. His words died before the accusing eyes of every man present. "The evidence is clear," Malcolm declared after long seconds of heavy silence. "George Lennox, you have violated ancient and sacred laws. In times past, your blood would be spilled as payment." George turned pale. "But this is Yule, a sacred time, when we will not contaminate ourselves with acts of violence, no matter how deserved." Malcolm stood up, leaning on his staff. "Therefore we declare you and your men are banished from these lands. You leave immediately. If any of you are seen again in territory under the protection of the clans represented here, the sentence will be death, without trial, without mercy. You cannot—" "We can, and we have." Angus stepped forward, stopping inches from George. "And if I were you, I would be grateful that these wise men spared your life, because if it were only up to me, you would not leave here unharmed." George was escorted out by 4 guards, his weak protests lost in the night. When the door closed behind him, the silence that fell over the hall was one of relief, but also shared shame. Shame that such a man had been received among them, that he had almost succeeded. Angus turned to Duncan, and for the first time since everything began, he looked older, tired, broken. "Duncan Ross, I have no words to thank you for what you did. You do not need words, Angus Thompson. I protected what is precious to me." Angus's eyes widened slightly as he understood the weight of those words. "My daughter is everything to me," Duncan said simply, without circumlocution, without shame. "And if you will permit me, I would like to formally ask for her hand in marriage, tomorrow during the Yule feast, before everyone." Angus remained silent for long moments, studying the face of the man before him. He saw honor there. He saw strength. He saw good intentions. He saw true love, the kind he himself had felt for his wife, the kind Flora deserved. He remembered the conversation with his daughter earlier. "You love her." It was not a question, but Duncan answered anyway. "With every fiber of my being." "Then you have my blessing and my eternal gratitude." Duncan walked back to the Thomson house with his heart beating strangely in his chest, not from fear or urgency, but from something warm and good he could not name. He found Flora waiting near the living room fireplace, already clean and in warm clothes, her loose hair falling in red waves over her shoulders. When she saw him, she stood up, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other across a distance that felt both too great and too small. Then Flora crossed the space between them and threw herself into his arms. Duncan caught her, holding her tightly, his face buried in her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and honey that seemed to have been created only to torture him. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Thank you for saving me, for arriving in time, for—" "Mo Cree," he interrupted softly, pulling her back just enough to look into her eyes. "You do not need to thank me. I would give my life for you if necessary, without hesitation, without thinking twice." "Duncan!" He raised his hand, lightly touching her face, his thumb caressing her cheek with a tenderness that completely contradicted the violence he had shown hours earlier. "I love you, Flora Thomson. I have loved you since the first time I saw you." But that was only a few weeks ago. No, he smiled, and it was the smile of one who guarded precious secrets. It was years ago. You were walking through the woods near the lake with a basket of wildflowers in your arms. The sun hit your hair, making it shine like red gold, and you were smiling. Not at anyone in particular, you were. Just smiling as if the simple act of being alive was joy enough. Flora felt her cheeks burn. You saw me. I saw you. And something inside me broke and rebuilt itself in that moment. I thought I was seeing a sea teacher, a fairy from the ancient legends, so beautiful, so full of light, that it could not be real. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. But you were real. You were real. And since then, I have never been able to take you out of my thoughts. Whether on our lands or on missions at the borders, you have always been in my heart, awaiting the right moment to approach and ask for your hand. Flora brought her hands to his face, holding it gently. All those years, I loved you from afar. I protected you without your knowing. I waited for the right moment, praying that when it came, you might feel for me at least a fraction of what I feel for you. More than a fraction, she whispered, tears running down her face. Duncan Ross, I love you completely. I have known you for a short time, but it is as if I have loved you all my life, as if I was waiting for you. He closed his eyes, as if hearing those words was a mixture of pain and blessing. When he opened them again, there was decision there. Then marry me during the Yule feast before everyone. Be my wife, Monique. Let me spend the rest of my life loving you as you deserve. Yes, the answer came without hesitation. Yes, Duncan, 1,000 times yes. The morning of the Yule feast dawned clear and cold, the sky washed clean by the night's snow, and now shining a deep blue. The entire village woke with renewed energy, despite, or perhaps because of, everything that had happened the day before. It was as if the expulsion of George Lennox had purified the air, leaving only what was good and true. The great hall was transformed. Candles burned on every available surface. Garlands of holly and yew hung. From the beams and in the center, the Yule log burned with high, steady flames, a promise of prosperity for the coming year. Long tables were laden with food, roasted venison, fresh bread, aged cheeses, dried fruit tarts, mead and whiskey flowing freely. And there was no distinction. Rich and poor sat side by side, sharing the same table, the same joy. Children ran among the adults, laughing, and musicians tuned their instruments, preparing for the dancing to come. Flora was at home, being prepared by Nell with reverent care. She wore her mother's dress, a deep green embroidered gown that caught the candlelight, contrasting with her red hair, transforming her into something ethereal. Nell secured her hair in elaborate braids, interwoven with ribbons and small sprigs of holly. Your mother would be so proud, Nell said, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the shawl over Flora's shoulders. So proud. Flora took the maid's hands, squeezing them tightly. Thank you, Nell, for everything, for always. When they arrived at the hall, all conversations ceased. Flora paused at the entrance, her heart pounding, and then she saw Duncan. He was near the main fireplace, wearing the formal Ross tartan, his hair tied back at the nape of his neck, and when his eyes met hers, everything else disappeared. He crossed the hall with determined steps, and when he reached her, he held out his hand. Flora took it, and together they walked toward the center of the hall, where Angus and the elders waited. The entire village followed them with their eyes, but there was no judgment there, only joy, approval, a collective blessing. Duncan stopped before everyone, still holding Flora's hand, and when he spoke, his voice echoed clear and strong throughout the hall. If she is to marry by Yule, then she will marry the man who would die to protect her. And then before everyone, Duncan Ross knelt. It was not submission, it was honor. It was a public declaration of love and respect. It was everything a Highlander could offer to the woman he loved. He looked at Angus, who stood beside the elders, and spoke with a voice charged with contained emotion. Angus Thomson, I come before you, and all assembled here to ask for your daughter Flora's hand in marriage. He gestured, and Thorquil approached, bringing a small wooden chest. Duncan opened it, revealing its contents. I bring alliances forged with neighboring clans, guaranteeing protection and prosperity for the Thomson lands. He pointed to sealed parchments. I bring a piece of land adjacent to your properties, so that our families may grow together, united. More documents, maps, clear markings. I bring my word, which will never be broken, my name, which will never be stained, and my sword, which will always be at the service of protecting Flora and everything that is hers." He closed the chest and looked directly into Angus's eyes. "Angus, Thomson, I bring you everything I am, and I ask for your daughter Flora as my wife." The silence in the hall was absolute. Even the children stopped moving, sensing the importance of the moment. Angus stepped forward, and there were tears in his eyes when he spoke. "Duncan Ross, you saved my daughter's life. You protected her honor when I failed to do so. You demonstrated courage, strength, and true love." His voice cracked slightly. "You are more than worthy of her. You are exactly the man I always prayed she would find." He extended his hand and Duncan gripped it firmly. "You have my blessing and my eternal gratitude." Duncan stood up and turned to Flora, who had tears streaming freely down her face. She raised her hands, touching his face with her fingertips in a gesture so intimate, so delicate, that it made half the women present sigh. "Yes, Duncan," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Before the Yule sun rises, yes. Today, now, always." The village exploded in applause, shouts of joy, whistles. Duncan pulled Flora close, and there, beneath the sprigs of holly hanging above them, an ancient symbol of love and protection, their lips met. The kiss was chaste, appropriate for the place and the many witnesses, but it carried the promise of everything to come. When they separated, both were smiling, and the world seemed brighter, warmer, more alive. The music began, bagpipes, fiddles, and someone played an ancient clarsach that produced celestial sounds. The Yule reel filled the hall, and Duncan pulled Flora into the dance, spinning her, making her laugh in a way she had not laughed for years. They danced until their legs ached, until sweat beaded on their brows despite the cold outside. They shared mead from the same cup, ate from the same plate, and every gesture was a blessing, a promise, love made visible. At one point, they needed air. They slipped out the side door, into the small adjacent courtyard, where the snow covered everything like a perfect white mantle. There, away from curious but respectful eyes, Duncan pulled her against him, just holding her, and Flora rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Is it real?" she whispered. "Is all this real?" "It is, and it will continue to be. Today, tomorrow, every day God gives us." "Duncan, Thathu Breaga," he murmured against her hair. "You are beautiful, and you are mine now. Mobheen, my wife." Flora raised her face and their lips met again, more deeply this time, allowing themselves to savor, explore, promise with more than words. When they finally separated, both were breathing faster, and Duncan rested his forehead against hers. That was when they heard a hesitant voice behind them. "Mr. Ross?" They turned and saw the boy, the one who had run through the snow to warn Duncan, who had risked everything to save Flora. He stood there, shy but determined, at the entrance to the courtyard. Duncan smiled and approached, kneeling to be at the boy's height. "Yes, lad. I just wanted to know if the young lady was well." Flora approached too, and when she saw the expression on the boy's face, genuine worry, relief at seeing her smiling, something squeezed in her chest, she knelt too, and pulled the boy into a firm embrace. "Thanks to you, I am more than well. Duncan told me what you did. You were brave, so brave. You saved me." The boy turned, red, not knowing where to look. I just ran. I just said what I saw, and that made all the difference." Duncan placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "A man, a true man, acts when he sees injustice, even when afraid. You did that, and I want to thank you." He signaled to Thorquil, who was waiting near the door, and approached with a small package. Duncan opened it, revealing a scian duv, the traditional Highlander dagger, with a handle crafted from wood and silver. "This belonged to my grandfather, and now it belongs to you, to remind you that true courage is not the absence of fear, but acting despite it." The boy's eyes widened, tears threatening to fall. "Mr. Ross, I cannot." "You can, and you will." Duncan placed the dagger in the small hands. "Keep it safe until you grow up and become a man. Then use it with honor. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." The boy held the dagger against his chest and smiled, a big, genuine smile. "No. Harm could come to such a kind-hearted young lady, miss, and while I ran I prayed you would be safe until help arrived. God heard." Flora, moved, kissed the boy's cheek, making him turn even redder. Duncan pretended to frown. "Now I am jealous. My betrothed kissing another man." The boy laughed, the sound clear and pure, and ran back into the hall, clutching his gift like a treasure. When they were alone again, Duncan pulled Flora back into his arms, and there, beneath the Yule, stars that shone like diamonds in the clean sky, he spoke the words she would cherish forever. "I want to marry you before Yule ends, agreed. The most beautiful moment to unite myself with you. I want to take you home. I want to wake up every day with you by my side. I want to build a life, a family, a future that is ours." "Yes," Flora whispered, her hands caressing his face. "Yes to everything. Always, yes." And when their lips met again, it was a sealed promise. It was love, declared. It was the beginning of something that not even the cruelest winter could freeze. Inside the hall, the Yule log continued to burn, its steady flames promising prosperity, light in the darkness, hope that would never fade. And Flora Thomson, soon to be Flora Ross, knew that this was the miracle she had prayed for, not just to be saved, but to be loved, to be chosen, to be free to choose back. Yule had never been so beautiful. The snow fell softly on the morning of the 9th day. Of Yule, covering the moor, the hills, and the roof of the Thomson house with a silent veil that seemed to bless everything it touched. Flora woke before dawn, her heart beating with that sweet mix of courage and trepidation. Today would be the day she would become Duncan Ross's wife, not in a grand chapel, but in the very home where she grew up, as dictated by the Scottish tradition that honoured both simplicity and community. Nell helped her dress with hands that trembled. More than she would admit, the chosen gown was deep green, the colour of the forest surrounding the house, simply embroidered details that reflected Flora herself, modest, strong, and luminous. The garlands of holly that Nell intertwined in her red hair shone like small living jewels. "You are ready, my girl," Nell murmured, with moist eyes she was not ashamed to show. "I have never seen a more beautiful bride, and I have never seen a love that was so deserved." Flora took a deep breath as she saw her reflection in the polished piece of metal that served as a mirror. The woman who stared back seemed made of hope. "I am ready." The great room of the Thomsons was full. Family, neighbours, members of allied clans, children nestled in the women's skirts. Everything was illuminated by dozens of candles and the high fire in the hearth, which cast warmth and gold onto the stone walls. In the windows, branches of holly, yew, and pine, as was customary for Yule, reminded them that God and the earth walked side by side in the life of the Highlands. But Flora saw only one man. Duncan stood near the fireplace, wearing the formal Ross tartan, his hair carefully tied back, his face cleaner and more serene than she had ever seen him. When his eyes met hers, the rest of the world dissolved. He remained motionless, not out of rigidity, but because the sight of her seemed to have anchored him to the ground. Angus walked Flora to him, as tradition required. In front of the minister, the community and God, he placed his daughter's hand in Duncan's. "Take care of her," Angus said, his voice husky, not with authority, but with love. "With my life," Duncan replied, and everyone there knew it was true. The Reverend McCleary, from the local parish, held up only a small book, not to read decorated vows, but to record the union after public consent. "Today," he said, "before God and these witnesses, we celebrate what is already confirmed in the hearts of these two young people. May this roof, which has welcomed Flora since birth, also welcome this moment." He spoke a few but profound words that described the beauty and love and union between a man and a woman, but, at the end, as local custom, he raised a short blessing in Gaelic, which drew emotional murmurs from the elders. "Bianaican dithiseo, a thigherna, agus dion angaul mar thene nach dochao chail riam. Bless this pair, O Lord, and guard their love like a fire that has never faded." Then he turned to Duncan. "Duncan Ross, before God and these witnesses, do you take Flora Thomson as your wife, to walk by her side in this life?" "Yes, I do." The answer came out strong, warm, almost broken by emotion. "Flora Thomson, before God and these witnesses, do you take Duncan Ross as your husband, to walk by his side in this life?" Flora smiled, that delicate smile he would carry forever. Yes, I do. The minister nodded, and with the sacred simplicity of the Highlands declared, Then by your word and the testimony of all present here, I declare you husband and wife. May God guide you, and may the earth sustain you. Before any applause echoed, Duncan took Flora's hand firmly, leaned in, and placed a reverent kiss on her forehead, a public gesture of respect, promise, and deep affection. The room exploded in joy. Clapping, celebratory whistles, laughing children, men stamping their feet on the floor, as was habit. The snow continued to fall outside, reflecting the light that escaped through the open door. As he walked out with Flora, Duncan removed his own tartan and wrapped it around her shoulders, symbolically marking her with the Ross colours, a gesture recognized by all as part of the clan acceptance ritual, enveloping her with his love, his colours, and his protection. Flora nestled against him, allowing herself to feel that new warmth, the warmth of a home that he wrapped her in the tartan, pulling her close to his chest, as if the very land that had shaped them resided there between his heartbeats. Flora. His voice was low, charged with reverence. Of all the paths I have walked, none led as far as the one that ended with you. Here is where my spirit finds rest. She raised her face, her cold fingers grazing his jaw, and Duncan leaned down to warm them with his large, protective hands. And you, she whispered, firm and moved, are the destiny my heart recognized. Before I had the courage to name it, he kissed her there before everyone, under the snow that fell like a promise and a blessing, and for the first time in her life, Flora knew she was exactly where God and fate always wanted her to be. The days that followed were a continuous celebration, feasts, dances, stories told around bonfires, children running between adults, the Yule log burning non-stop. But for Flora and Duncan, the world narrowed down to two. The first morning waking up. As a wife was something Flora would never forget. She opened her eyes slowly, still lost between dream and reality, and found Duncan already awake, propped up on his elbow, watching her with an expression so tender that tears burned her eyes. "Good morning, Mobeen," he whispered, his fingers lightly caressing her face. "Good morning," she replied, her voice still husky with sleep, and smiled. Duncan closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the moment. "I have never had such a beautiful morning in my life, waking up with a private son in my arms." He opened his eyes again, and there was something vulnerable there. "You complete me, a grade. You make me a whole man." Flora moved closer, kissing him with a tenderness that quickly turned into something deeper, more urgent. When they finally separated, both were breathing faster, and Duncan pulled her against his chest, holding her as if he feared she was a dream that might vanish. "I love you," she whispered against his skin, more than words can say. "Tha gelagamort, mo nigjan don forever." Months passed like pages turning in a well-written book. Winter gave way to spring, which blossomed into summer, which gilded into autumn. Flora transformed the Ross house into a true home, not just with furniture and decorations, but with love, care, attention to every detail that would bring comfort to Duncan when he returned from his long days working the lands, training men, protecting borders. She found genuine joy in caring for him, in having his favorite meal waiting when he arrived hungry and tired, in having hot water ready to wash off the day's sweat, in having the bed warm and cozy. It was not a duty that oppressed her. It was love expressed in practical actions, in silent gestures that spoke more than 1,000 words, and Duncan honored her in return. He never walked through the door without seeking her out first, without pulling her into a hug, without asking about her day. He brought her small gifts, wildflowers he found in the hills, beautiful stones from the river, once an orphaned deer fawn that she bottle-fed until it could return to the forest. He protected her not just from physical dangers, but from malicious gossip, unnecessary worries, the weight the world tried to place on female shoulders. One autumn evening, sitting together by the fireplace, Flora was on his lap, with her head resting on his shoulder, Duncan idly, stroking her hair as they talked about nothing and everything, plans for the approaching winter, childhood stories, dreams for the future. "Do you know what I hope for?" Duncan said suddenly, his voice laden with something Flora could not immediately identify. "What?" I can hardly wait to see you conceive our child, to see your belly grow with the life we created together." He placed his large hand on her stomach, still flat, but full of possibilities. The next warrior of the Ross clan. Or perhaps, he smiled, the most delicate lady, beautiful like her mother. Flora felt tears well up in her eyes. She turned in his lap, framing his face with her hands. "That would be the greatest blessing." "It will be," he corrected, kissing her softly. "When God wills it, it will be." And God willed it. 2 years later, on a cold winter night with the Yule festivities approaching again, Flora was placing candles in the windows of the house, while Duncan sat near the fireplace holding the small Ewan with extreme care. Almost a year old, dark hair like his father, and the serene tranquility of his mother, sleeping deeply against the broad chest that served as a perfect pillow. Flora watched from afar, her heart so full it seemed impossible to hold more love. Duncan, the feared warrior, the man of brutal strength when necessary, held that baby as if he were made of crystal, murmured songs in Gaelic so low Flora could barely hear, and had an expression of absolute peace on his face. "The candles are lit," she said softly, approaching. Duncan raised his eyes, smiling. "Come, sit with me." Flora snuggled up next to them, her head on Duncan's shoulder, her hand resting lightly on the sleeping baby's chest, feeling the constant breathing, the small but powerful warmth of new life. "We are blessed," Duncan murmured. "We are." Later, after placing Ewan in his cradle carefully so as not to wake him, Flora returned to the kitchen, where she had already prepared Duncan's favorite stew, venison with roots and herbs, slow-cooked to fill the house with an aroma that was, in itself, welcoming. The door opened with a blast of cold air, and Thorquill entered carrying a large bundle. "I hope there's enough food for a hungry uncle," he announced with his characteristic smile, closing the door behind him. "There is always room for you at our table," Flora replied, smiling too. Thorquill placed the bundle on the table. "I brought a gift for my favorite nephew." "He's your only nephew," Duncan pointed out, but he was smiling. "A detail." Thorquill opened the bundle, revealing a perfectly carved wooden sword, the right size for very small hands. "Is it too early to teach him how to handle the blade?" Duncan laughed, the sound rich and deep. "Give him a few more months. Soon enough he will be old enough." Thorquill inhaled deeply, his eyes closing in theatrical appreciation. "That aroma, Flora, your hands, are blessed. What did I do to deserve such a talented sister-in-law?" "You saved my life by helping Duncan find me," Flora replied simply, serving generous portions into ceramic bowls. "For that, take a generous serving of stew." They sat together, the three of them, and shared the meal with silent gratitude. Thorquill told stories of the day, minor border issues, village gossip, plans for Yule which would begin in days. Duncan listened, commented, laughed, and Flora simply absorbed it. All, the normality, the peace, the family. It was life, simple, ordinary, precious. After Thorquill left, satisfied and warmed, Flora began tidying the kitchen, putting away the clean bowls and sweeping the crumbs that had fallen near the fireplace. Duncan went out to fetch more firewood, stacking the dry logs next to the fire to ensure they would last the night, and then walked through the house, checking the windows, making sure they were all well sealed against the cold that intensified with the proximity of winter. "Does Nell arrive next week?" Duncan asked, adjusting a piece of cloth that blocked a persistent draft. "Yes, if the roads allow," Flora replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "The letter she sent said the relatives are well, but that she misses home. And little Ewan, of course." Duncan smiled, returning to the kitchen. "She treats him as if he were her own. It is her heart, too big to fit only in herself." Flora paused, tilting her head. "I think she is in love." "Nell?" Duncan raised his eyebrows, surprised. "With whom?" "With the widowed blacksmith. Did you notice how she always finds reasons to pass by the forge?" Duncan laughed, the sound rich and deep. "So it's not just me who acts foolish when in love." Flora smiled, finishing putting away the last bowls. When she turned around, she found Duncan standing behind her, and before she could say anything, he pulled her into his arms right there in the kitchen. "Thank you," he said against her hair. "For what?" "For everything. For this home. For our son. For every day I wake up next to you. For being exactly who you are." Flora pulled away just enough to look into his eyes. "You gave me everything, Duncan. freedom, choice, love, a home where I can be completely myself, a son who is a living miracle. How could I not thank you every day? He kissed her, long and deep, and when they separated, there was a promise there of future nights, of years, still to come, of love that would only grow with time. That night, lying together in the bed they shared, listening to Ewan's soft breathing in the nearby cradle, Duncan pulled Flora against him, completely enveloping her in his arms. "Do you remember when you prayed for a miracle?" he murmured in the darkness. "I remember. You were my miracle too, Agrad. I didn't even know I was incomplete until I found you. I didn't even know something was missing until you filled the empty space." Flora turned in his arms, kissing him with all the tenderness she felt. "Then the miracle was double, because you saved me from a fate that would have destroyed my soul. You gave me love when I thought I would only have duty. You gave me choice when the world wanted to deny me. You make me very happy. And you," Duncan replied, his voice husky and low, "gave me a reason to be stronger, to be better, to fight not just for honor or clan, but for something infinitely more. Precious, for you, for him, for us, you also make me very happy, wife." They fell asleep like that, intertwined, and when the snow began to fall outside, the first snow of the new Yule, it covered the world with a perfect white mantle. And in the Ross house, where candles burned in the windows as a promise of refuge, where a baby slept safely, where two hearts beat as one, the miracle continued. Not just on Solstice Day, but in every dawn, in every shared smile, in every touch, every word, every moment stolen from a world that tried to be harsh but could not penetrate the walls that love had built. Flora Thomson, now Flora Ross, had found her home, and Duncan Ross had found his completeness. The Yule miracle was not just salvation, it was love, deep, boundless love, that made two hearts stronger together than they could ever be apart. And this love would last not just one winter, not just one life. It would last forever, like the stars that shone over the Highlands, like the snow that returned every year, like the traditions passed down from generation to generation, eternal, true, complete. In the Scottish Highlands, where winter is cruel and traditions are sacred, two hearts found in Yule more than celebration. They found destiny, they found love, and they proved that the best miracles are not those we ask for, but those God knew we needed before we even knew how to ask. If you stayed with me until the end, please leave your like on the video and click the hype button so this romance can reach more hearts passionate about true stories. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the next romances full of adventures, intrigues, secrets, and much passion. Share with someone who loves Christmas miracles, historical stories, or simply believes in the power of true love. I look forward to seeing you in the next romance. Until then, may you be blessed with love that warms even the harshest winters. Thank you for watching. See you soon.